What's up, everyone? Tonight, we're diving into the deepest mysteries of human civilization, literally and figuratively. We're going to explore lost cities that time forgot, civilizations that vanished in a legend, and archaeological discoveries that make you question everything you thought you knew about the past. You probably wouldn't survive half the places we're visiting tonight, but that's the beauty of imagination and a comfortable bed. So before you get comfortable, like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your city and what time it is where you are right now. I love knowing where this journey is taking us across the globe. Now turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background sound, and let's begin our journey tonight. You're floating above the Mediterranean Sea in the early morning light, watching sunbeams pierce through crystal clear water that seems to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The surface ripples gently beneath you, and somewhere far below, maybe 9,000 years into the past, lies the most famous lost civilization that never was, Atlantis. You drift downward through layers of blue-green water, each meter deeper, taking you further from the world of facts and closer to the realm of pure imagination. Plato, that ancient Greek philosopher who probably spent way too much time thinking about ideal societies, gave us this story around 360 BCE. He wasn't writing a travel guide, though some people today still seem to think he was offering GPS coordinates. The water grows cooler against your skin as you descend, and you begin to make out massive stone structures emerging from the sandy bottom. Circular patterns spread outward like ripples frozen in time. Concentric rings of land and water that Plato described with the precision of an architect and the flair of a storyteller. The main island, according to his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, was larger than Libya and Asia combined, which should have been your first clue that we're dealing with philosophical allegory rather than ancient real estate listings. You swim closer to what appears to be a colossal temple, its columns still standing despite millennia underwater. The limestone surface feels rough beneath your fingertips, covered in a thin layer of marine growth that makes everything shimmer with an otherworldly green glow. Schools of silver fish dart between the ruins like living memories, their movements creating shifting patterns of light and shadow across the ancient stones. The city spreads out before you in perfect geometric precision. 3 circular harbors connected by channels wide enough for the largest ships. You can almost hear the echo of ancient voices calling across the water, the sound of bronze being hammered in workshops, the splash of oars cutting through waves. Historians still debate whether Plato intended Atlantis as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and material excess, or whether he was simply creating the world's most elaborate thought experiment about ideal governance. But here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting, I mean where reality crashes the philosophical party. While Atlantis itself remains firmly in the realm of imagination, real places have been drowning for millennia. The Mediterranean is full of actual sunken cities, from Alexandria's royal quarters to entire Roman ports that now rest beneath the waves. Marine archaeologists have discovered settlements that really did vanish beneath rising seas, their streets and buildings preserved in underwater museums that nobody intended to create. You glide through what might have been a marketplace, past stone stalls where merchants once sold goods from across the known world. The Atlanteans, in Plato's telling, were master engineers who controlled a maritime empire that stretched from Gibraltar to Egypt. They had hot and cold running water, a luxury that would impress even today's home improvement enthusiasts, and their central temple was covered in silver and topped with gold. Because apparently, even in philosophical allegories, property values matter. The most fascinating detail isn't the wealth or the technology, though. It's the time frame. Plato placed Atlantis 9,000 years before his own time, which would put its destruction around 9,600 BC, right at the end of the last ice age. This isn't coincidence, it's literary genius. He chose a moment when the world really was transforming, when rising seas really were swallowing coastlines, when the geography itself was being rewritten by melting glaciers. You surface briefly, treading water above the ruins, watching how the afternoon light dances across the waves. The irony isn't lost on you. We're searching for a fictional sunken city in an ocean that's actually full of real sunken cities. Thonis-Heracleion, which we'll visit later, really did exist and really did sink. Petra off the coast of Greece is a real Bronze Age town you can swim through today. Port Royal in Jamaica went down in an earthquake, taking its reputation as the wickedest city on Earth to a watery grave. But back to our mythical metropolis. As you dive again, deeper this time, you notice something Plato probably never considered: the silence. Real underwater ruins are eerily quiet, muffled by the weight of water and centuries. Sound travels differently here, distorted and dreamlike. Your breathing becomes the only rhythm, steady and meditative, like the world's oldest white noise machine. The deepest parts of a city reveal the most elaborate structures, pyramids and temples that rival anything built above water. Little known fact: Plato described Atlantean architecture as incorporating both Egyptian and Greek influences, which makes sense when you realize he traveled extensively and was basically creating the ancient world's first fusion cuisine, except with buildings instead of food. Academic debate continues to swirl around whether any real location inspired Plato's vision. Some scholars point to Minoan Crete, with its advanced Bronze Age civilization that ended catastrophically around 1450 BCE. Others suggest Tartessos in southern Spain, a wealthy trading center that mysteriously vanished from historical records. A few bold researchers even propose Santorini, where a massive volcanic eruption created exactly the kind of sudden destruction Plato described. You swim through the royal palace, past throne rooms where Atlantean kings allegedly ruled with wisdom until corruption took hold. The walls still bear traces of the intricate metalwork Plato described: copper, tin, and mysterious orichalcum that was apparently more precious than gold. Modern metallurgists have never quite figured out what orichalcum actually was, though bronze with really good marketing seems like a solid theory. The current carries you through residential districts where ordinary Atlanteans lived their extraordinary lives. According to Plato, they ate well, lived in harmony with nature, and practiced a form of democracy that would make modern political scientists weep with envy. Then they got greedy, started wars, and the gods decided to hit the reset button with a flood and earthquake combo that would make any disaster movie director jealous. As evening approaches and the underwater light begins to fade, you find yourself in the city's outermost ring, where the harbor meets the open ocean. This is where reality and imagination blur most beautifully. Every ripple in the sand could be a street. Every shadow could be a building. Every play of light could be the ghost of a civilization that never was, but somehow feels more real than many places that actually existed. The water grows warmer as you float back toward the surface, carrying with it the weight of thousands of years of human longing for perfection. Atlantis endures not because it was real, but because it represents something we recognize: the rise and fall of human ambition, the fragility of even the greatest achievements, and the eternal human tendency to create paradise and then find ways to lose it. You're standing at the entrance to a Roman city on what should have been just another ordinary morning in 79 AD. Except nothing about this place has been ordinary for nearly 2,000 years. The cobblestones beneath your sandaled feet are still warm from yesterday's sun, or rather, from that final, terrible sun that rose on August 24th and never properly set. The air carries the faint scent of baked bread and olive oil, as if the bakeries are still running, which is impossible since the bakers became part of the architecture sometime around noon on eruption day. You step through the sea gate, one of Pompeii's main entrances, and immediately notice the deep ruts carved into the volcanic stone by countless cartwheels. These aren't just ancient potholes. They're evidence of a thriving commercial hub where traffic jams were probably as frustrating as anywhere else in the Roman Empire. The streets stretch before you in perfect geometric precision, a testament to Roman urban planning that would make modern city designers weep with envy if they weren't too busy dealing with zoning permits. The morning light filters through the volcanic haze that still seems to hang in the air, casting everything in a golden amber glow that makes the preserved city feel like it's trapped in eternal sunset. You walk down the Via dell'Abbondanza, the main commercial street, past shops whose signs are still visible on their facades. A thermopolium, essentially ancient Rome's version of a food truck, but with better real estate, displays its marble counter with circular holes where clay pots once held hot stew and wine. The menu is still there, painted on the wall. Lentils, chicken, and fish sauce that Romans loved almost as much as modern people love arguing about pineapple on pizza. The silence is profound and slightly unsettling. This should be a city of 40,000 people going about their morning routines, but instead, you're walking through the world's largest archaeological preserve where every step reveals another frozen moment. A loaf of bread sits on a bakery counter, carbonized but still recognizably bread-shaped after 19 centuries. Historians still debate whether the preservation was immediate or gradual, but the evidence suggests that pyroclastic flows moved so quickly that people were essentially freeze-dried mid-gesture. You pause at the House of the Vetii, where wealthy merchant brothers once entertained guests with elaborate frescoes that would make ancient Roman interior designers proud. The walls bloom with mythological scenes, painted in colors so vivid they seem fresh from the artist's brush. Red ochre and Egyptian blue dance across plaster surfaces that survived better underground than most modern paint jobs last above ground. The central courtyard garden has been replanted according to pollen analysis from the original eruption, a detail that ancient Romans probably never expected archaeologists to obsess over 2 millennia later. The most haunting discovery isn't architectural, though. It's human. You come across one of the famous plaster casts, created by Giuseppe Fiorelli in the 1860s when he realized that the voids in the hardened ash were body-shaped. By pouring plaster into these spaces, he revealed the final moments of Pompeii's residents in heartbreaking detail. A dog strains against his chain. A family huddles together. A gladiator lies in the barracks, his helmet nearby. These aren't statues. They're three-dimensional photographs captured in volcanic ash. The forum spreads before you like an ancient outdoor mall, surrounded by temples, government buildings, and colonnades where citizens once gathered to conduct business and gossip about their neighbors' questionable fashion choices. Mount Vesuvius looms in the distance, looking deceptively peaceful for a mountain that essentially turned an entire city into a museum exhibit. The Romans knew it was a volcano. Strabo had written about its volcanic nature decades earlier, but they apparently thought it was dormant enough to ignore. Famous last words, volcanic edition. Little known fact, Pompeii was actually hit by earthquakes for 17 years before the big eruption, starting with a major one in 62 AD that damaged many buildings. The residents spent nearly 2 decades dealing with ongoing construction and repairs, like living in a perpetual home renovation show. Some buildings were still being rebuilt when Vesuvius decided to end the construction season permanently. You climbed the stepped streets toward the amphitheater, passing houses where wealthy Romans displayed their status through elaborate atrium decorations and private baths. The social hierarchy is literally built into the architecture. Larger homes for the elite, smaller apartments for the working class, and tiny spaces for slaves and servants. Democracy might have been invented in Greece, but Roman cities were very clear about who belonged where on the social ladder. The amphitheater itself is remarkably well preserved, its stone seating still arranged in neat tiers where 20,000 spectators once cheered for gladiatorial contests. Graffiti covers the walls, not modern vandalism, but ancient messages that give us glimpses into Roman daily life. Marcus Love's Spendusa is carved next to Gaius was here and various advertisements for upcoming games. Apparently, the human urge to write, "I was here," on public walls transcends both centuries and civilizations. Academic debate continues about exactly what killed most of Pompeii's residents. The traditional narrative blamed suffocating ash, but modern analysis suggests that most died from thermal shock as superheated gas clouds reached temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Death was instantaneous, which explains the preservation of final moments but makes the whole experience significantly less romantic than early archaeologists imagined. As afternoon shadows lengthen across the ancient streets, you find yourself in the Garden of the Fugitives, where a group of 13 people were found who had almost made it to the city walls before being overtaken by the pyroclastic flow. They're arranged as they fell, still reaching toward escape that came just a few steps too late. It's simultaneously tragic and oddly comforting, proof that even in the face of unimaginable disaster, people kept trying, kept hoping, kept moving towards safety until the very end. The preservation extends to the most mundane details. Wooden beams carbonized but retain their shape. Fabric impressions remain in the ash. Even food was preserved. Eggs, nuts, bread, and the contents of cooking pots provide a snapshot of a Mediterranean diet that wouldn't look out of place on a modern Italian table. The continuity is startling. You could probably follow a Pompeii recipe today and recognize the results. You end your visit in the Villa of Papyri, just outside the city proper, where the only intact library from the ancient world was discovered. Hundreds of scrolls, carbonized but still readable through modern technology, contain works by Epicurean philosophers that were thought lost forever. It's like finding an ancient Roman hard drive that somehow survived the ultimate system crash. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows across streets where cart wheels still echo in stone ruts, where ancient Romans went about their final ordinary day before becoming part of an extraordinary archaeological record. Pompeii isn't just a ruined city. It's a moment in time preserved with accidental perfection, a place where the past feels so immediate you could almost step back into it if volcanic ash weren't such an effective time-stopping agent. You're pushing through dense jungle vines in the Petén rainforest of Guatemala, where the air hangs thick and humid around you like a living, breathing entity that hasn't quite decided whether you belong here. Every step forward requires negotiating with thorny bushes that seem personally offended by your presence, while overhead, a canopy so dense that noon feels like twilight filters the tropical sun into scattered green gold coins of light. The humidity wraps around you like a warm, damp blanket that nature forgot to wash. And somewhere in the distance, howler monkeys are having what sounds like a very heated political debate about territory rights. Your machete cuts through another curtain of hanging lianas, and suddenly you stop dead in your tracks. Rising from the jungle floor like a green-covered pyramid, a massive stone structure emerges from centuries of botanical camouflage. This is Tikal, one of Maya civilization's greatest urban centers, where sophisticated astronomers and mathematicians once calculated the movements of Venus with accuracy that would make modern scientists moderately jealous. The pyramid before you reaches 154 feet into the canopy, roughly the height of a modern 15-story building, except this one was built without cranes, bulldozers, or safety regulations that would give contemporary construction workers nightmares. You begin climbing the steep stone steps, each one worn smooth by 1,000 years of tropical rainfall and the footsteps of Maya priests who climbed these same stairs to perform rituals that connected earth to sky. The limestone blocks fit together with precision that suggests Maya engineers had figured out something about construction that didn't require modern power tools or YouTube tutorials. Your hands trace the carved glyphs that still decorate the temple walls, intricate symbols that form one of the world's most sophisticated writing systems, capable of recording everything from royal genealogies to astronomical observations to what was probably ancient Maya poetry about how hard it is to build pyramids in jungle humidity. The view from the top reveals the true scope of what lies hidden beneath this green ocean. Temple tops emerge from the canopy like stone islands, connected by invisible causeways and plazas that stretch for miles in every direction. This isn't just a single monument. It's the skyline of a major metropolitan area that once housed over 100,000 people, making it larger than most European cities of its time. Between 600 and 900 AD, this jungle was home to one of the most advanced civilizations in the Americas, complete with urban planning, sophisticated agriculture, and a calendar system more accurate than the one Europe was using. You descend into the jungle's embrace again, following what archaeologists have mapped as ancient Maya roads. Raised stone causeways called sakbi that connected cities across hundreds of miles of dense forest. The Maya weren't just pyramid builders. They were urban planners who created transportation networks that would impress modern highway engineers. Assuming those engineers were comfortable working without GPS and with significantly more jaguars in the vicinity. The sound of your footsteps is muffled by centuries of decomposing leaves, creating a carpet so thick it feels like walking on ancient memory foam. Cecropia, trees tower overhead, their hollow trunks providing perfect acoustics for the territorial announcements of spider monkeys who apparently think you're trespassing on their personal jungle highways. Little known fact, the Maya actually cultivated many of these forest species, turning what looks like wild jungle into carefully managed food forest that supported massive urban populations without completely destroying the ecosystem, a trick that modern cities are still trying to figure out. You come across a partially excavated palace complex, where royal families once lived in multi-story limestone mansions decorated with murals that rival anything created in medieval Europe. The preservation is remarkable. Pigments still cling to protected walls, showing scenes of Mayan nobility dressed in elaborate costumes made from jaguar pelts and quetzal feathers, which was basically ancient Central America's version of haute couture, except with significantly more religious symbolism and probably better durability. The silence here is different from Pompeii's fossilized quiet. This is living silence, broken by the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the understory and the occasional crack of a branch adjusting to its supporting role in this vertical ecosystem. You realize you're walking through a library where every tree, every vine, every scattered stone carries information about how one of history's most sophisticated civilizations managed to thrive in what European explorers would later dismiss as impenetrable wilderness. Academic debate continues to swirl around exactly why Maya cities were abandoned during the 9th century. Climate data suggests a series of severe droughts coincided with the classic Maya collapse, but recent discoveries indicate that some centers continued thriving while others emptied completely. The picture is complex, less apocalyptic ending, more like watching different neighborhoods in a major city experience varying degrees of success and failure over several generations. You explore a ball court where Maya athletes played a ritual game that combined elements of soccer, basketball, and religious ceremony. The rules are still debated by scholars, but the courts themselves reveal sophisticated understanding of acoustics. You can whisper at one end and be heard clearly at the other, 500 feet away. Either Maya engineers were acoustical geniuses, or they had really good reasons for wanting to eavesdrop on ball game conversations from a safe distance. The jungle has been reclaiming these cities for over 1,000 years, but it's been a remarkably gentle conquest. Instead of destroying the architecture, the forest has wrapped around it like a protective green bandage. Tree roots follow the courses of ancient walls, stabilizing structures that might otherwise have collapsed. Vines create natural scaffolding that holds weathered stones in place. It's conservation through invasion, nature acting as the world's most patient museum curator. You discover a residential area where middle-class Maya families lived in stone houses that would be considered luxury accommodations by many contemporary standards. Indoor plumbing, sophisticated drainage systems, and private courtyards speak to a level of urban development that European cities wouldn't achieve for centuries. These weren't primitive forest dwellers. They were citizens of a complex society that had figured out how to build sustainable cities in challenging environments. As afternoon light filters through the canopy in shifting patterns of green and gold, you find yourself at a sacred cenote, a natural limestone sinkhole that served as both water source and portal to the underworld in Maya cosmology. The water reflects the sky in a perfect circle framed by jungle growth, creating a natural mirror that connects earth to heaven. Maya priests threw precious offerings into these waters, jade, gold, and sometimes people, though the human sacrifice aspect was probably less popular with the participants than with the theological committees. The preservation extends beyond architecture to include organic materials that would have long since decomposed in other climates. Wooden lintels carved with intricate hieroglyphs still span doorways. Textile fragments reveal sophisticated weaving techniques. Even food remains provide glimpses into Maya cuisine. Chocolate, chili peppers, and maize prepared in ways that would be recognizable on modern Mexican tables. You end your jungle exploration at a partially restored plaza where Maya astronomers once tracked the movements of celestial bodies with precision that enabled them to predict eclipses centuries in advance. The jungle frames this ancient observatory like a living calendar, where the movement of shadows through the canopy marks time just as surely as the stone monuments once did for Maya timekeepers. You descend into darkness that has been waiting for over 2,000 years to reveal its secrets. The air grows cooler with each step down the concrete stairway, carrying with it the faint scent of ancient earth and something else. Something that feels like anticipation made tangible. Electric lights hum softly overhead, casting long shadows that dance across walls as you make your way deeper into what might be the most extraordinary underground gathering in human history. The first glimpse stops you completely. Row upon row of terracotta soldiers stretch into the dimly lit distance, each one standing at perfect attention in a formation that has never broken rank. Their silence is absolute, profound, almost reverent, the kind of quiet that makes you want to whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb warriors who have been maintaining this eternal watch since 210 BCE. You're standing in Pit, one of the Terracotta Army, where approximately 6,000 clay soldiers guard the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, who apparently had very strong opinions about adequate security in the afterlife. Your footsteps echo softly on the walkway that winds between the excavated trenches, and as your eyes adjust to the underground lighting, the details become breathtaking. These aren't mass-produced figurines churned out by some ancient pottery factory. Each face is individually crafted, unique, bearing distinct expressions that range from stern determination to what looks like mild annoyance at having to stand in formation for 2 millennia. The level of artistic detail suggests that ancient Chinese sculptors either took their jobs very seriously or were working for an emperor who had zero tolerance for sloppy craftsmanship. You lean closer to examine an infantry soldier in the front rank, noting how his armor plates are individually sculpted, how his top knot is styled differently from his neighbors, how even his shoelaces are carefully rendered in clay. The pigments that once painted these warriors in vivid blues, reds, and greens have mostly faded, but traces remain in protected crevices, enough to imagine how this underground army once blazed with color in the torchlight of ancient ceremonies. The organization is militarily precise. Infantry soldiers stand in the front ranks, followed by archers, cavalry, and officers, each positioned according to ancient Chinese battle formation. Behind them, horse-drawn chariots wait in permanent readiness, their bronze fittings still gleaming after more than 2,000 years underground. The horses are masterpieces of observation, nostrils flared, ears alert, muscles tensed as if they might spring forward at any moment to carry their clay riders into an eternal battle that will never come. Historians still debate whether these figures were meant to be portraits of actual soldiers from Qin Shi Huang's army or idealized representations of military perfection. DNA analysis of workers' remains found in the construction areas suggests that artisans came from across the empire to work on this project, bringing regional sculptural traditions that created the incredible diversity you see in these faces. It's like an ancient Chinese yearbook where every graduate was required to serve in the afterlife military, except with significantly better job security and no awkward photos. You move through the excavation area, where archaeologists continue their painstakingly slow work of uncovering and preserving warriors who emerge from the earth like ancient seeds finally ready to sprout. Each figure requires months of careful cleaning and conservation, a process that involves more chemistry than archaeology. The clay itself tells stories. Mineral analysis reveals that the raw materials came from deposits within 20 miles of the mausoleum, meaning this entire army was literally born from local soil. Little known fact, The terracotta warriors were discovered completely by accident in 1974 by farmers digging a well during a drought. Yang Jifa and his neighbors were looking for water and instead found what might be the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Imagine explaining that career change to your family. From farming to accidentally becoming one of the most important figures in Chinese archaeology because you dug your well in exactly the right spot. The scale becomes overwhelming as you realize that what you're seeing is only a fraction of the total site. 3 main pits have been excavated, but ground-penetrating radar suggests dozens more remain buried. Conservative estimates put the total number of terracotta figures at over 8,000 soldiers, plus hundreds of horses and chariots. The mausoleum complex itself covers nearly 40 square miles, making it larger than many modern cities and definitely more organized than most contemporary urban planning projects. In Pit 2, you encounter the cavalry units, warriors standing beside their horses with a casual grace that suggests centuries of partnership. The detail extends to the horses' individual expressions, from alert war horses to what appears to be at least one horse that looks distinctly unimpressed with the whole eternal guard duty situation. Each bridle, each bit, each decorative element is crafted with precision that speaks to the importance of cavalry in ancient Chinese warfare. The technology required to create this army was staggering for its time. Large-scale kiln operations, assembly line production techniques, and quality control systems that ensured each piece met imperial standards. The bronze weapons found with the warriors, swords, crossbow triggers, spearheads, were still sharp after more than 2,000 years underground, protected by chromium coating that wasn't rediscovered by modern metallurgy until the 20th century. Ancient Chinese weapons technology was apparently running a few centuries ahead of the rest of the world's military-industrial complex. Academic debate continues about the deeper meaning of this underground army. Some scholars interpret it as evidence of Qin Shi Huang's megalomania, a ruler so paranoid about death that he recreated his entire military in clay. Others see it as sophisticated religious practice, connecting earthly power to cosmic protection. The truth probably combines both interpretations, imperial ego and genuine spiritual belief working together to create something unprecedented in human history. You find yourself in Pit 3, the smallest of the excavated areas, which appears to have been the command center. Here, higher-ranking officers stand in more complex formations, their armor more elaborate, their bearings suggesting the weight of command responsibility even in clay form. The hierarchy is clear even in death. Ancient Chinese bureaucracy extending seamlessly into the afterlife with the same attention to rank and protocol that characterized the living empire. The preservation is miraculous and fragile simultaneously. The clay figures survived underground because of specific moisture and temperature conditions that kept them stable for millennia. Exposure to air begins a slow degradation process that archaeologists race against, using techniques that range from traditional conservation methods to cutting-edge polymer treatments. Each warrior that emerges from the earth represents a victory against time itself. As you complete your circuit through the excavated pits, the evening lights dim to protect both the artifacts and your night-adjusted vision. The warriors fade into shadow, but somehow become more present, more alive in the darkness that mirrors their original underground existence. They were never meant to be seen by living eyes. These clay guardians created for an emperor's eternal peace. Yet here they stand, patient witnesses to human ambition and artistic achievement, waiting in their perfect ranks for whatever comes next in their very, very long military service. You're standing at the entrance to a crack in the earth that seems to barely qualify as a pathway, wondering if ancient Nabatean merchants had a very different definition of major thoroughfare than modern urban planners. The Six stretches before you like a narrow sandstone canyon that nature carved with the precision of a master sculptor, except instead of marble, the medium was 200 million years of geological patience. The walls rise nearly 300 feet on either side, creating a corridor so narrow that in some places you could stretch your arms and touch both sides simultaneously, assuming you don't mind explaining to your travel insurance why you're wedged between ancient rocks like the world's most archaeological sandwich filling. The first steps into the sick feel like entering another dimension where time moves differently and echoes carry conversations from 2,000 years ago. Your footsteps create a soft percussion against smooth stone that has been polished by millions of feet. Traders carrying frankincense and myrrh, pilgrims seeking divine connection, and tourists like yourself who are mostly seeking Instagram opportunities and moderate cardio workouts. The temperature drops noticeably as the canyon walls block direct sunlight, creating a natural air conditioning system that ancient merchants probably appreciated after crossing the brutal Jordanian desert. Light filters down from the narrow strip of sky overhead, casting the red and pink sandstone in constantly shifting hues that range from dusty rose to deep burgundy. The rock formations tell stories in layers, geological narratives written in stone that span hundreds of millions of years, from ancient sea beds to wind-carved sculptures that look suspiciously like abstract art installations, except with significantly better longevity and no controversial artist statements to debate. As you walk deeper into the canyon, small shrine niches begin appearing in the walls. Rectangular carvings that once held sacred statues or offerings to gods who protected travelers. These bettles, as archaeologists call them, represent Nabatean religious practice that blended influences from across the ancient world. The Nabateans were essentially ancient globalists, absorbing cultural and religious elements from everywhere their trade routes touched, creating a cosmopolitan society that would make modern multiculturalists moderately envious of their cultural integration skills. The sick curves and winds for over a mile, each turn revealing new geological wonders and architectural surprises. Roman-era paving stones still line sections of the path, evidence that even after the Nabateans, this route remained crucial for regional commerce. Little-known fact: the Nabateans engineered a sophisticated water management system throughout the Sick, with channels, cisterns, and dams that collected precious rainfall from the desert storms. They turned one of the world's most arid regions into a thriving urban center through hydraulic engineering that would impress modern water conservation specialists. Roughly halfway through your canyon journey, you encounter the first major carved monument, a series of tomb facades that demonstrate the Nabateans' mastery of rock-cutting techniques. These aren't simple cave dwellings. They're architectural statements carved directly from the living rock face with details that include classical columns, pediments, and decorative elements that blend Hellenistic, Roman, and local artistic traditions. The craftsmanship required tools, techniques, and artistic vision that positioned Petra as one of the most sophisticated urban centers of the ancient world. The sound environment in the Sick is remarkable. Every whisper carries, every footstep echoes, creating a natural acoustic amplification that the Nabateans probably used for dramatic effect when leading important visitors to their rose-red capital. Modern sound engineers would kill for acoustics this good, assuming they could figure out how to incorporate 300-foot sandstone walls into contemporary architectural designs. Academic debate continues about exactly how the Nabateans managed their complex society in what appears to be an inhospitable desert environment. Recent archaeological evidence suggests they developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, including terraced farming and strategic crop selection that maximized yield for minimal rainfall. They weren't just surviving in the desert. They were thriving, controlling trade routes that connected India and China with the Mediterranean world, essentially running the ancient equivalent of Amazon Prime, except with camels instead of delivery trucks. As you round the final curve of the Sick, anticipation builds with each step. The canyon walls seem to close in slightly, focusing your attention forward like a natural theater designed to create maximum dramatic impact for the reveal that's coming. Your shadow and the shadows of the canyon walls create a constantly changing play of light and darkness that makes every step feel choreographed by geological forces that have been rehearsing this moment for millions of years. Then you see it. Through a narrow opening between towering rock faces, a sliver of carved pink stone catches the light. The treasury facade begins to reveal itself piece by piece as you approach the canyon's end, like watching an ancient photograph develop in slow motion. The anticipation is architectural and psychological. The Nabateans designed this approach to build excitement, to transform the simple act of arriving at their city into a pilgrimage experience that announced Petra's importance before you even officially entered their territory. The treasury, Al-Khazna in Arabic, emerges fully as you exit the Sikh, rising 130 feet from the canyon floor in impossible detail. This isn't just carved stone. It's carved architecture that defies understanding of how ancient people could create such precision without modern tools. Corinthian columns support elaborate pediments decorated with mythological figures, urns, and floral motifs that demonstrate cultural influences from across the Mediterranean world. The facade is so perfectly preserved that it looks like it could have been completed yesterday, assuming yesterday's construction crews had access to first-century engineering techniques and unlimited patience for detail work. Historians still debate the treasury's original function. Despite its popular name, it was almost certainly a tomb rather than an actual treasury, probably built for an important Nabatean king around the 1st century CE. The name comes from local legends that claimed bandits hid treasure in the urn carved at the top of the facade, legends that led to centuries of people shooting at the urn with rifles, trying to break it open and retrieve non-existent treasure. The bullet marks are still visible, creating what might be history's most expensive case of target practice based on questionable assumptions about ancient architecture. The plaza in front of the treasury buzzes with modern activity that contrasts sharply with the eternal stillness of the carved facade. Tour guides explain architectural details in a dozen languages while tourists attempt to capture the perfect selfie with one of the world's most photographed monuments. Bedouin merchants offer camel rides and traditional crafts, continuing commercial traditions that stretch back to their Nabatean predecessors, though probably with better profit margins and fewer international trade wars to navigate. As afternoon light begins its slow transformation of the treasury's color palette from pale pink to deep rose to rich burgundy, you realize you're experiencing exactly what the Nabateans intended. This wasn't just architecture. It was theater, psychology, and engineering combined to create an experience that announced their sophistication, wealth, and cultural achievement to anyone approaching their city. Mission accomplished. Ancient marketing department. You're approaching a horizon where stone lotus buds rise against the Cambodian dawn like prayers made manifest in sandstone and ambition. The causeway beneath your feet stretches across what was once a vast moat, now mostly dry earth that cradles water lilies, and the occasional confused tourist wondering why ancient Khmer kings felt the need to build the world's largest religious monument in what appears to be the middle of absolutely nowhere. The air carries the weight of tropical humidity mixed with something indefinable, perhaps the accumulated reverence of 9 centuries of pilgrims, or maybe just the lingering incense from yesterday's Buddhist ceremonies. Angkor, what emerges before you like a mountain range designed by divine architects who had very strong opinions about symmetry and unlimited access to skilled stone carvers. The temple complex covers 400 acres, making it larger than Vatican City and significantly more photogenic, though probably with fewer diplomatic incidents per square meter. 5 central towers rise in perfect quinkings formation, for corner spires surrounding a central peak that reaches 213 feet toward the heavens, representing Mount Meru, the cosmic center of the Hindu universe, where gods presumably hold their most important interdimensional meetings. Your sandaled feet find purchase on stone blocks that have supported millions of pilgrims since King Suryavarman VII commissioned this architectural prayer in the early 12th century. The craftsmanship beneath your touch speaks to an empire at its absolute peak. The Khmer Empire controlled much of Southeast Asia, commanding trade routes and agricultural resources that funded construction projects ambitious enough to make contemporary urban planners weep with professional envy. Each stone was cut to fit perfectly with its neighbors, creating walls that have survived monsoons, wars, and centuries of jungle encroachment without benefit of modern construction adhesives or building codes. The outer gallery draws you into a world where walls become storybooks carved in stone. Bas-reliefs stretch for thousands of feet, depicting scenes from Hindu epics with detail so intricate you could spend weeks examining individual panels. The churning of the ocean of milk unfolds across an entire wall, gods and demons working together to extract the elixir of immortality from cosmic seas, which sounds like the plot of an ancient superhero movie, except with significantly better costume design and no sequel rights to negotiate. Light filters through stone lattice windows, casting geometric shadows that shift with the sun's movement across a sky that seems impossibly vast above the temple courtyards. The interplay of light and shadow was precisely calculated by Khmer architects who understood that sacred space required more than just impressive stonework. It needed to breathe, to change, to interact with celestial rhythms in ways that connected earthly worship to cosmic cycles. Academic debate continues about whether Angkor, what was primarily a temple dedicated to Vishnu, or an elaborate royal tomb disguised as religious architecture. The orientation provides clues. Unlike most Khmer temples that face east toward the rising sun, Angkor, what faces west, traditionally associated with death and the realm of Vishnu. Recent scholarship suggests it served multiple functions: temple, tomb, and astronomical observatory combined into a single magnificent statement about royal power and divine connection. You climb the steep steps toward the central sanctuary, each level representing a different realm in Hindu cosmology. The staircases are intentionally precipitous. Some approach 70-degree angles, requiring climbers to maintain physical and spiritual focus as they ascend from the earthly realm toward divine connection. Ancient Khmer architects apparently believed that achieving enlightenment should involve at least moderate cardiovascular exercise and excellent balance skills. The view from the upper galleries reveals Angkor Wat's true genius. It's not just a temple, but a three-dimensional mandala designed to mirror the structure of the universe. The rectangular galleries represent the earthly world, while the central towers embody the sacred peaks where gods dwell. Causeways and moats reproduce the cosmic ocean, creating a miniature universe where human devotion could access divine presence through careful architectural symbolism. Little-known fact, the entire complex functions as a massive calendar. The number of steps, the lengths of galleries, even the spacing between towers correspond to cosmic cycles measured by ancient Khmer astronomers. The temple's proportions reflect calculations about lunar months, solar years, and the precession of equinoxes that wouldn't be rediscovered by European astronomy for several centuries. Apparently, when you're building for the gods, accurate timekeeping becomes a theological requirement rather than just a convenience for scheduling prayers. Water management at Angkor demonstrates engineering sophistication that rivals modern urban systems. The complex network of canals, reservoirs, and moats serve practical functions: flood control, irrigation, transportation, while simultaneously creating the sacred geography required by Hindu cosmology. The Western Baray, one of the massive reservoirs, covers 11 square miles and represents the cosmic ocean that surrounds Mount Meru. It's urban planning that doubles as religious architecture, practical engineering that serves spiritual purposes. As afternoon light begins its slow transformation of the sandstone from warm honey to deep gold, you find yourself in courtyards where devout worshippers once circumambulated sacred spaces in clockwise meditation. The worn stones beneath your feet carry the memory of countless pilgrims who walked these same paths seeking divine blessing, enlightenment, or simply the profound peace that comes from participating in something vastly larger than individual existence. The acoustics in the central sanctuary create an otherworldly resonance. Your whispered words echo and multiply, returning to you transformed by stone chambers that seem to breathe with accumulated prayer. Khmer architects understood that sacred sound required sacred space, designing chambers where human voices could merge with divine presence through careful attention to architectural acoustics. Apsaras dance across every surface, celestial beings carved with such grace and individuality that each seems to embody a different aspect of divine feminine energy. Over 1,800 of these heavenly dancers adorn Angkor Wat's walls, each wearing unique costumes, jewelry, and expressions that speak to the artistic sophistication of Khmer sculptors who somehow managed to make stone appear to move with fluid grace. The preservation challenges are immense and ongoing. Sandstone weathers differently than other building materials, requiring conservation techniques that balance structural stability with historical authenticity. International teams work continuously to prevent collapse while maintaining the temple's spiritual integrity, a delicate balance between modern engineering and ancient sacred architecture. As evening shadows begin to lengthen across courtyards that have witnessed nearly a millennium of human devotion, you realize that Angkor Wat achieves something remarkable. It makes the infinite feel intimate, the cosmic feel personal. Standing in spaces designed to connect Earth to heaven, you understand why this temple complex continues to inspire awe in visitors from cultures and centuries far removed from its Khmer creators. The setting sun transforms the central towers into silhouettes against the sky, painted in shades of saffron and rose, creating the iconic image that has drawn pilgrims and photographers for generations. This daily performance, stone lotus buds blooming against the infinite sky, reminds you that some human achievements transcend their original purpose, becoming windows into possibilities for connection between earthly effort and something beautifully, mysteriously beyond ordinary understanding. You're breathing thin mountain air that tastes like clouds and ancient secrets, standing at 7,972 feet above sea level, where the world feels simultaneously closer to heaven and farther from everything you thought you understood about architectural possibility. Mist swirls around your ankles like ghostly llamas as you climb stone steps that seem to have been carved by people who had very different relationships with both gravity and oxygen than most modern humans. The Andes stretch endlessly in every direction, their peaks disappearing into clouds that look suspiciously like they're holding classified information about Incan engineering techniques. The approach to Machu Picchu follows the same path that Hiram Bingham took in 1911. Though you're probably carrying significantly more sophisticated camera equipment and definitely more snacks than the Yale archaeologist who rediscovered this citadel that local Quechua people had never actually lost. The jungle gives way gradually to terraced mountainsides, where ancient agricultural engineering still demonstrates how to farm on slopes that would give contemporary landscape architects serious vertigo and possibly recurring nightmares about soil erosion. Morning light filters through the perpetual mist that gives this place its ethereal quality, illuminating granite blocks that fit together with precision that makes modern construction joints look like amateur hour at geological summer camp. Each stone was shaped to match its neighbors so perfectly that you couldn't slide a knife blade between them, which is impressive considering Incan builders achieved this without metal tools, wheels, or detailed blueprints drawn on paper that wouldn't be invented in the Americas for several more centuries. You enter the citadel through terraces that step down the mountainside like a gigantic stone staircase designed for giants with excellent taste in agricultural engineering. These aren't just decorative landscaping. They're sophisticated farming systems that prevented erosion while maximizing arable space on terrain that most civilizations would have dismissed as too vertical for agriculture. The Incas apparently looked at impossible mountain slopes and thought, perfect spot for a garden party that will last for centuries. The urban sector spreads before you in careful zones that demonstrate Incan city planning at its most sophisticated. Royal quarters occupy the highest ground, with progressively lower status housing arranged down the mountainside according to social hierarchy that was literally built into the landscape. It's urban design where your address automatically announced your place in society, which was probably more honest than most contemporary status symbol systems, though significantly less flexible for social mobility. Little known fact, Machu Picchu was never actually a lost city in the dramatic sense that early 20th century explorers claimed. Local indigenous families have been living in the area and maintaining some of the structures for centuries before Bingham's arrival. The discovery was more like archaeological tourism meeting indigenous knowledge, except with significantly more international publicity and probably better funding for the people who already knew where everything was located. You trace the Intihuatana stone with your fingertips, feeling granite that has been precisely carved to track the sun's movement across the sky throughout the year. This astronomical clock still functions perfectly after 5 centuries, demonstrating Incan understanding of celestial mechanics that enabled them to predict solstices, equinoxes, and probably the optimal times for planting crops that would thrive at extreme altitude. It's a sundial that doubles as a cosmic calendar, assuming you don't mind your timepiece being carved from several tons of immovable mountain granite. The acoustics in the central plaza create natural amplification that allowed Incan leaders to address large gatherings without need for electronic sound systems or awkward shouting that would undermine royal dignity. Your voice carries clearly across the stone courtyards, bouncing off precisely angled walls that transform human speech into something that sounds almost supernatural. Ancient Incan architects apparently understood that effective leadership required not just political authority, but also really excellent acoustic engineering. Academic debate continues about Machu Picchu's exact function within the Incan Empire. Some scholars argue it was a royal estate for Emperor Pachacuti, while others suggest it served as a religious center dedicated to solar worship. Recent evidence indicates it may have been both, a combination summer palace and sacred site where royal families could enjoy mountain views while conducting important astronomical observations that informed imperial agricultural policy. The preservation is remarkable and puzzling. Unlike many ancient cities that were gradually abandoned, Machu Picchu appears to have been systematically emptied sometime after the Spanish conquest, with valuable objects removed and entrances sealed. The residents didn't flee in panic. They conducted an organized evacuation that left the city structurally intact, but empty of the people and possessions that had given it life for over a century. You explore residential areas where Incan families once lived in stone houses with trapezoidal windows and doorways that have survived earthquakes that would level contemporary buildings. The engineering incorporates seismic resistance techniques that modern architects are still studying, joints that allow movement without collapse, foundations that grip bedrock like geological anchors, wall angles that distribute stress in ways that turn potentially destructive force into structural stability. Water management throughout the complex demonstrates hydraulic engineering that rivals modern municipal systems. Stone channels carry fresh water from mountain springs through the citadel, serving fountains, baths, and agricultural terraces with gravitational efficiency that requires no pumps, filters, or maintenance schedules. The Incas built a water system that has functioned continuously for 5 centuries, which should probably inspire some contemporary urban utilities to reconsider their approach to infrastructure longevity. As afternoon clouds begin to gather around the mountain peaks, creating the misty atmosphere that gives Machu Picchu its dreamlike quality, you realize you're experiencing exactly what Incan architects intended. This wasn't just a city. It was a carefully orchestrated encounter between human ambition and natural grandeur, designed to remind inhabitants that civilization's greatest achievements come from working with landscape rather than conquering it. The Temple of the Sun demonstrates astronomical precision that enabled Incan priests to track celestial events with accuracy that informed agricultural, religious, and political decisions throughout the empire. Windows align perfectly with sunrise on winter solstice, creating light displays that transformed religious ceremonies into cosmic theater where human devotion merged with solar worship through careful architectural choreography. Storage facilities reveal sophisticated understanding of high-altitude food preservation. Stone bins with ventilation systems kept maize, potatoes, and quinoa fresh for years, providing food security that supported urban populations at elevations where most agricultural systems would fail. The Incas figured out how to create abundance in environments that challenge basic survival, which suggests their agricultural technology was considerably more advanced than Spanish conquistadors realized. You end your exploration at the Guardian's house, where a lone structure overlooks the entire citadel from its commanding position on Huayna Picchu's lower slopes. From this vantage point, the entire city spreads below you like a three-dimensional map that reveals Incan urban planning in perfect clarity. Streets, plazas, temples, and residences arranged with geometric precision that transforms architectural necessity into artistic expression. The setting sun turns the granite walls golden, creating the magical hour when Machu Picchu transforms from archaeological site to something that feels almost alive. Shadows lengthen across courtyards where Incan families once gathered, where children played, where daily life unfolded against mountain vistas that remain unchanged since the 15th century. In this light, with mist rising from the valleys below, you understand why this place continues to inspire wonder in visitors from cultures and centuries far removed from its Incan creators. You're standing on one of the most isolated pieces of land on Earth, where the nearest neighbor is over 1,400 miles away, and the Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly in every direction like a blue infinity that makes you question whether other continents are just elaborate myths. The wind carries salt spray mixed with the kind of profound silence that only exists when you're literally in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nearly 1,000 stone guardians who have been keeping watch over absolutely nothing but grass, sheep, and the occasional confused tourist for the past 500 years. Easter Island, Rapa Nui to its indigenous inhabitants, feels like the edge of the world, which it essentially is. The volcanic soil beneath your feet speaks to explosive origins that thrust this triangular speck of land from the ocean depths millions of years ago, creating a platform for one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries. The moai scattered across this landscape weren't just carved. They were birthed from the island's volcanic heart, shaped by hands that understood something about permanence that the rest of us seem to have forgotten in our age of planned obsolescence and disposable everything. Your first encounter with a moai stops you completely. These aren't the squat, cartoonish Easter Island heads that popular culture has burned into collective memory. They're towering figures with full bodies buried beneath centuries of accumulated soil and volcanic ash. The nearest statue rises nearly 15 feet above ground, its elongated face gazing inland with an expression that manages to be simultaneously serene and slightly judgmental, as if silently critiquing your life choices that led to standing on a remote Pacific island photographing rocks that are older than most European cathedrals. The craftsmanship becomes more remarkable the longer you examine it. This particular moai was carved from a single block of volcanic tuff, shaped with basalt hand tools that required patience, skill, and probably a very high tolerance for repetitive motion injuries. Every feature, the prominent nose, the thin lips, the elongated ears, was precisely sculpted to create not just a statue, but a presence that commands respect across centuries. The Rapa Nui sculptors weren't just making art. They were creating ancestors in stone, permanent embodiments of cultural memory that would outlast everything else their civilization created. You walk among the scattered moai like a visitor in an outdoor sculpture gallery curated by time and mystery. Each statue is unique, different sizes, slightly varied facial features, distinct expressions that range from stoic dignity to what looks suspiciously like ancient Polynesian skepticism about whatever was happening in the 13th century. Nearly 900 moai dot the island, with about half still remaining in and around Reino Raraku Quarry, where they appear to be walking in slow procession down the volcanic slopes toward the sea. Little known fact, the moai were never meant to be headless torsos. Excavations have revealed that most statues have full bodies extending deep underground, some reaching over 30 feet in total height. Centuries of wind-blown soil and volcanic deposits buried everything below the neck, creating the illusion of disembodied heads that has dominated popular imagination. It's like discovering that all the famous landmarks you thought you knew were actually just the tips of much larger, much more impressive icebergs. The logistics of moai creation boggle the contemporary mind. The largest completed statue stands over 30 feet tall and weighs approximately 82 tons, which means Rapa Nui engineers figure out how to quarry, carve, transport, and erect monuments that would challenge modern construction crews equipped with cranes, bulldozers, and probably several safety violations. These ancient sculptors worked with hand tools and human power, moving multi-ton statues across the island using techniques that archaeologists are still debating. Though most theories involve rope, wooden rollers, and significantly more cooperation than most modern communities can manage for much simpler projects. Academic debate continues to swirl around exactly how the Moai were transported from the Reno-Rurako quarry to their final positions around the island's perimeter. Traditional theory suggested they were rolled on wooden logs, but recent experiments indicate they may have been walked upright using ropes, a technique that makes the statues appear to waddle across the landscape in a manner that's either profoundly spiritual or mildly ridiculous, depending on your perspective on ancient engineering solutions. The island's ecological history provides sobering context for the Moai mystery. When Polynesian settlers arrived around 1200 CE, Rapa Nui was covered in forests dominated by massive palm trees. By the time European explorers reached the island in 1722, it was almost completely deforested, a transformation that coincided with the end of Moai construction and the collapse of the complex society that created these monuments. Whether deforestation caused societal collapse or resulted from it remains one of archaeology's most cautionary environmental tales. You climb toward Reno-Rurako, the volcanic crater that served as both quarry and sculptural workshop for the Moai builders. The slopes are littered with statues in various stages of completion, some nearly finished, others barely begun, creating an ancient assembly line frozen in time. It's like walking through a sculptor's workshop where the artist stepped out for lunch sometime in the 15th century and never returned to finish their commissions. The afternoon light transforms the volcanic landscape, casting long shadows that bring the Moai faces into sharp relief. From certain angles, the statues seem almost alive, their stone features shifting with the changing light in ways that suggest consciousness, wisdom, or at least mild awareness of your presence among them. The wind carries whispers of grass and salt that might be echoes of ancient ceremonies, or might just be the sound of Pacific trade winds doing what they've done for millions of years. Near the crater's edge, you discover Moai that remain partially buried, their heads emerging from grassy slopes like ancient thoughts surfacing from collective memory. These partially excavated statues reveal the full scope of Rapa Nui artistic achievement. Bodies decorated with petroglyphs, ceremonial details that were never meant to be seen by casual observers, artistic elements that speak to sophisticated cultural practices that extended far beyond simple statue carving. The mystery deepens when you realize that almost all Moai face inland, their backs turned to the ocean that brought their creators to this remote island. Only 7 statues face the sea, positioned at Ahuakivi to honor the first explorers who found Rapa Nui. The inland orientation suggests these monuments weren't watching for threats from the ocean, but protecting something on the island itself, perhaps the communities, the resources, or the cultural practices that made their creation possible. Historians still debate whether the Moai represent specific ancestors, generic protective spirits, or something else entirely. Recent linguistic analysis of Rapa Nui oral traditions suggests they embody mana, spiritual power that connected living communities to ancestral wisdom. Each statue was positioned to watch over particular areas, creating a network of stone guardians that provided both physical and metaphysical protection for island inhabitants. As evening approaches and the Moai settle into their familiar silhouettes against the Pacific sunset, you find yourself contemplating isolation and permanence in ways that rarely occur on more connected continents. These statues have been standing vigil for centuries, witnessing sunrises and storms, volcanic eruptions, and human visitors, maintaining their quiet dignity through changes that would overwhelm less substantial monuments. The silence here isn't empty. It's full of presence, of watching, of stone consciousness that has outlasted the civilization that created it. Standing among the Moai as darkness gathers, you understand why Easter Island continues to fascinate visitors from around the world. It's not just a mystery of how or why these monuments were built. It's the profound stillness they maintain, the patient watching they continue, the reminder they provide that some human achievements transcend their original purpose to become something timeless, mysterious, and beautifully enduring. You're walking through morning mist that rises from the harbor of Alexandria, where the Mediterranean laps against stone quays that once welcomed ships carrying the most precious cargo in the ancient world: scrolls, books, and the accumulated wisdom of human civilization. The air tastes of salt and papyrus, mixed with the faint aroma of ink and scholarly ambition that seems to emanate from the very stones beneath your sandaled feet. Ahead of you rises the most legendary institution of learning that ever existed, a place where knowledge was currency, wisdom was power, and librarians held the keys to understanding everything from the movement of stars to the proper preparation of fish sauce. The Great Library of Alexandria emerges from the morning haze like a vision of intellectual paradise, its columned halls stretching endlessly in directions that seem to violate basic principles of architecture and possibly geography. Founded around 295 BCE by Ptolemy I, this wasn't just a library in the modern sense of a quiet place where people whisper and check out romance novels. This was a research university, a publishing house, a scientific laboratory, and a diplomatic center rolled into one magnificent institution that made contemporary universities look like modest book clubs with delusions of grandeur. You approach the main entrance through gardens where scholars stroll in animated discussion about mathematical theorems, astronomical observations, and probably the ancient equivalent of academic politics that made faculty meetings just as tedious 3 centuries before Christ as they are today. The sound of your footsteps mingles with the rustle of papyrus scrolls and the scratch of reed pens on writing surfaces, creating a symphony of intellectual activity that has been continuous for over 3 centuries until very recently in historical terms. The entrance hall overwhelms your senses with the scale of human knowledge made manifest. Shelves stretch from floor to ceiling, holding an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls that represent the collected wisdom of Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Jewish, and dozens of other civilizations. The air is thick with the scent of papyrus and cedar oils used to preserve manuscripts, creating an olfactory environment that contemporary libraries can't match despite their superior climate control and significantly lower fire risk. Little known fact, the library operated what was essentially an ancient copyright violation system on an industrial scale. Any ship entering Alexandria's harbor was required to surrender all books and scrolls for copying, with owners receiving copies while the library kept the originals. This aggressive acquisition policy built the collection rapidly while probably creating the world's first international intellectual property disputes, though with significantly fewer lawyers and substantially more philosophical arguments about the nature of knowledge ownership. You wander through reading rooms where scholars from across the known world gather around low tables, unrolling scrolls that contain everything from Homer's epics to Euclid's mathematical proofs to detailed treatises on medicine, astronomy, and geography. The diversity is staggering. Texts in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and languages you can't identify, representing the intellectual traditions of every civilization that ancient ships could reach with reasonable hope of not being eaten by sea monsters. The copying rooms hum with activity as scribes work meticulously to reproduce manuscripts, their reed pens moving across fresh papyrus with rhythmic precision that creates a gentle background percussion. Each copy requires weeks of careful work, making books incredibly valuable and librarians incredibly powerful in societies where information meant survival, profit, and occasionally the difference between successful military campaigns and embarrassing defeats that got recorded in someone else's history books. Academic debate continues about exactly what caused the library's decline, but the truth appears more complex than the dramatic single-event destruction that popular imagination prefers. Rather than burning in one spectacular conflagration, it seems to have suffered death by 1,000 cuts, budget reductions, political instability, religious conflicts, and the gradual shift of intellectual centers from Alexandria to Constantinople and Baghdad. It's the ancient equivalent of watching a great institution slowly starve through administrative neglect rather than dramatic catastrophe. You find yourself in the astronomical section, where Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy using nothing more than shadows, geometry, and intellectual audacity that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. His calculations were off by less than 200 miles on a planet that measures nearly 25,000 miles around the equator. Precision that makes contemporary GPS technology seem only moderately more impressive, though admittedly more convenient for ancient merchants trying to navigate trade routes. The medical texts reveal knowledge that was simultaneously advanced and terrifying by modern standards. Herophilus conducted systematic dissections to understand human anatomy, while his colleague Erasistratus mapped the nervous system and distinguished between arteries and veins. Their surgical procedures show sophistication that European medicine wouldn't rediscover until the Renaissance, though their understanding of infection control was probably less rigorous than contemporary operating room protocols. Historians still debate whether the famous story of Hypatia, the mathematician and philosopher who was murdered by Christian mobs in 415 CE, represents the symbolic end of the library's golden age, or simply one tragic episode in a longer decline. Recent scholarship suggests the library had already lost much of its influence by Hypatia's time, but her death certainly marked the end of Alexandria's role as the Mediterranean's premier center of learning and the beginning of centuries when European scholarship would move elsewhere. The preservation challenges were immense even in ancient times. Papyrus deteriorates in humidity, burns enthusiastically, and provides excellent nesting material for insects that apparently had no respect for intellectual property or scholarly achievement. Librarians fought a constant battle against moisture, fire, pests, and probably scholars who had never learned proper scroll handling etiquette despite presumably being educated enough to know better. You explore the translation workshops where scholars work to render text from one language into another, creating the intellectual bridges that allowed knowledge to flow between cultures. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, was reputedly created here by 70 scholars working independently who somehow produced identical translations, which either represents divine intervention or the ancient world's most successful example of academic collaboration without plagiarism accusations. The mathematics section holds works that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries. Euclid's Elements was composed here, establishing geometric principles that are still taught today with remarkably little modification for a textbook that's over 2,000 years old. Apollonius worked out conic sections, while Archimedes visited to discuss mechanical principles that would later influence everything from medieval siege engines to Renaissance engineering marvels. As afternoon light filters through the high windows, casting geometric patterns across reading tables, where scholars continue their eternal quest for understanding, you realize you're witnessing the intellectual foundation of Western civilization. Every scientific principle, every mathematical theorem, every philosophical argument that would later influence European thought was being developed, refined, or preserved in these halls by people who understood that knowledge was humanity's most precious resource. The geography section contains maps that reveal how much ancient scholars knew about the world's true scope. They had calculated distances between cities, mapped coastlines, and understood ocean currents well enough to enable trade networks that spanned from Britain to India. Their geographic knowledge was more accurate than European cartography would be for the next 1,000 years, which suggests that losing the library's accumulated wisdom set back human understanding by centuries. As evening approaches and oil lamps begin to flicker throughout the reading rooms, creating pools of warm light that make ancient wisdom seem almost alive, you understand why the Library of Alexandria continues to symbolize the pinnacle of human intellectual achievement. It wasn't just a building full of books, it was an idea made manifest. The belief that knowledge belongs to humanity as a whole, that wisdom grows through sharing, and that the proper response to ignorance is not censorship, but more learning, better questions, and the patient accumulation of understanding that transforms information into wisdom. You're standing in the heat-shimmered streets of ancient Babylon, where the air tastes of dust and ambition mixed with the distant promise of something that may or may not have existed, but has captivated human imagination for over 2 millennia. The Euphrates River flows lazily nearby, its muddy waters carrying the whispers of merchants, priests, and storytellers who may have embellished their tales just enough to transform impressive architecture into impossible wonder. Around you, the greatest city of the ancient world buzzes with activity, but your eyes search the horizon for something that might be the most famous garden that never was. The morning sun beats down on brick-paved streets where Babylonian citizens go about their daily business of trading, governing, and probably gossiping about whether King Nebuchadnezzar II really built those legendary terrace gardens for his homesick Median wife, or whether the whole thing was ancient Mesopotamia's most successful marketing campaign for a city that was already pretty impressive without needing to invent horticultural impossibilities. The heat creates mirages that dance across the distance, making you wonder if that's how legends begin, with optical illusions that look so beautiful people decide they must be real. You approach the palace complex where the hanging gardens supposedly rose like a green mountain from the flat Mesopotamian plain, each level cascading with exotic plants that somehow thrived in a desert climate through engineering magic that would make contemporary irrigation specialists weep with professional envy. The scale described by ancient writers is breathtaking. Terraces rising 400 feet into the sky, supported by arches and columns that created artificial hills where paradise could bloom despite geography's obvious objections to the whole project. Climbing what may or may not be the legendary stone stairways, you feel each step worn smooth by centuries of feet that may have belonged to gardeners, visitors, or possibly just persistent archaeologists hoping to find evidence that these wonders actually existed somewhere other than in the fevered imaginations of ancient travel writers who may have had very loose relationships with factual accuracy. The air grows marginally cooler as you ascend, whether from elevation or wishful thinking, and the sound of trickling water seems to whisper from every direction. Little known fact: the Hanging Gardens don't appear in any contemporary Babylonian records, despite Babylonians being meticulous record keepers who documented everything from grain transactions to royal genealogies to probably ancient Mesopotamian parking violations. The earliest descriptions come from Greek and Roman writers who lived centuries after the garden's supposed construction, which makes this wonder about as historically reliable as celebrity gossip that's been passed through a game of ancient telephone. The terraced levels unfold before you like steps to heaven, each one overflowing with vegetation that seems impossible in this arid landscape. Palm trees sway gently overhead, their fronds casting shifting shadows across pathways lined with flowering shrubs that perfume the air with scents of jasmine, rose, and other exotic blooms that would have required trade networks spanning continents. Water flows down through ingenious channels, creating both irrigation and the gentle sound of running streams that transforms this artificial mountain into an oasis of tranquility. The engineering required to create such gardens would have been staggering for any ancient civilization. Multi-story irrigation systems, waterproof terraces, structural supports capable of holding thousands of tons of soil and stone, all accomplished without benefit of modern pumps, concrete, or building codes that would require environmental impact studies before attempting to build paradise in a desert. If the gardens existed, they represented hydraulic engineering that wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance, assuming Renaissance engineers were crazy enough to attempt gardening on this scale. Academic debate continues to swirl around whether the Hanging Gardens were real, legendary, or a case of ancient historical confusion where impressive gardens in Nineveh got attributed to Babylon through the kind of geographical mix-up that happens when historians rely on sources who may never have personally visited either city. Some scholars suggest the gardens were real but smaller than described, while others argue they're complete fiction inspired by other impressive Mesopotamian architectural achievements. You trace the stone channels that supposedly carried water from the Euphrates to the highest terraces through a system of screws, pumps, and gravitational engineering that would have required constant maintenance by teams of workers who understood hydraulics better than most contemporary plumbers. The logistics alone are mind-boggling. Getting water up 400 feet using ancient technology would have been like solving a physics problem that most civilizations considered impossible until they invented significantly better tools and probably industrial-grade aspirin for the headaches. The upper terraces reveal the full scope of this horticultural ambition, where trees from distant lands supposedly grew in carefully prepared soil that had to be transported from regions with completely different climate conditions. Cedar from Lebanon, palm from Egypt, fruit trees from Media, creating botanical diversity that would challenge modern greenhouse technology and definitely exceed the patience of most contemporary gardeners who struggle to keep houseplants alive in climate-controlled environments. As afternoon heat builds, you find shade beneath what may be ancient grape arbors that still produce fruit after more than 2,000 years, though that's probably optimistic thinking rather than actual viticultural evidence. The cooling effect of flowing water and dense vegetation creates microclimates that make this elevated garden feel like an island of comfort in the hostile desert heat, demonstrating how advanced environmental design could create livable spaces in challenging conditions. The view from the highest terrace encompasses the entire Mesopotamian plain, where the Euphrates meanders through agricultural fields that have fed civilizations for millennia. From this elevation, you understand why the gardens captured ancient imagination. They would have been visible from miles away, rising from the flat landscape like a green beacon announcing Babylon's power to transform even basic geography through imperial will and engineering audacity. Historians still debate who actually built the gardens, with some evidence suggesting they may have been created by an Assyrian queen rather than Nebuchadnezzar, while others argue they're a conflation of multiple impressive ancient gardens that got combined into one legendary wonder through centuries of storytelling that improved with each retelling. The truth may be less important than the story's endurance, proof that humans need to believe in places where technology and nature achieve perfect harmony. The preservation question becomes moot when discussing something that may never have existed, but the legend's survival demonstrates how powerful architectural ideas can outlive actual buildings. Whether real or imaginary, the Hanging Gardens influence garden design to this day, inspiring landscape architects who attempt to create vertical gardens, green walls, and sustainable urban agriculture that brings nature into harsh environments through careful engineering. As evening approaches and the harsh desert light softens into golden hues that make everything seem more magical and less historically problematic, you realize that the Hanging Gardens' greatest achievement may be their persistence in human imagination. Real or legendary, they represent the eternal human desire to create paradise through ingenuity, to make gardens bloom in impossible places, and to believe that technology can serve beauty rather than just efficiency. The cooling air carries phantom scents of ancient blooms and the gentle sound of water that may flow only in dreams and stories, but feels absolutely real in the gathering dusk where legends become more substantial than facts, and imagination proves more enduring than stone. You're standing on a windswept hill in northwestern Turkey, where centuries of human ambition have literally piled up on top of each other like the world's most expensive archaeological layer cake. The morning breeze carries scents of wild thyme and the faint echo of ancient arguments about whether this particular mound of stones and pottery shards is really the Troy that launched 1,000 ships, or just another Bronze Age settlement that happened to have decent strategic positioning and unfortunately attractive neighbors. Beneath your feet lie not one city, but 9 distinct layers of civilization, each built on the ruins of its predecessor in a pattern that suggests either admirable persistence or a stunning lack of imagination in real estate development. The excavation spreads before you like an open history book written in stone walls, pottery fragments, and the occasional bronze arrowhead that makes everyone wonder whether they're looking at evidence of Homer's epic war or just routine Bronze Age property disputes that got out of hand. Heinrich Schliemann's 19th century trenches cut through the site, like archaeological surgery, performed with more enthusiasm than precision, revealing multiple cities while simultaneously destroying evidence that modern archaeologists would kill for, assuming they could figure out how to use time travel for professional purposes rather than just correcting embarrassing historical interpretations. You descend into the excavated areas where Troy too emerges from carefully cleaned earth, its massive stone walls and elaborate gates suggesting a city wealthy enough to attract both trade and envy from neighboring civilizations. The craftsmanship in these Bronze Age foundations speaks to sophisticated engineering that created defenses capable of withstanding siege warfare. Though whether those sieges involve heroic Greeks seeking to rescue beautiful Helen or just routine Bronze Age commerce protection remains one of archaeology's most romantically contested questions. The famous treasure that Schliemann claimed belonged to King Priam turned out to be from the wrong historical layer entirely. About 1,000 years too early for Homer's Troy, which is either embarrassing archaeological error or evidence that ancient treasure burying was more common than contemporary insurance policies might suggest. The golden diadem, earrings, and ceremonial weapons that Schliemann's wife Sophie posed, wearing for Victorian photographs, represented real Bronze Age wealth. Just not the specific Bronze Age wealth that classical literature had promised. Little-known fact: Homer's Iliad and Odyssey weren't written down until centuries after the events they described, passed through generations of oral tradition that probably improved the story with each telling until historical accuracy became significantly less important than narrative entertainment value. Comparing archaeological evidence to Homeric description is like trying to match modern archaeological findings to Hollywood movies, occasionally illuminating, usually frustrating, and definitely requiring generous interpretation of both dramatic license and ancient poetic exaggeration. You explore Troy 6, the layer that chronologically aligns with the traditional date of the Trojan War around 1180 BCE, where massive walls still stand that could have withstood the kind of prolonged siege that Homer described. The masonry employs sophisticated techniques that created defenses capable of protecting a wealthy trading city that controlled access between Europe and Asia, strategic positioning that would make any ancient civilization wealthy enough to inspire jealousy, invasion, and possibly epic poetry about the whole dramatic situation. Academic debate continues about whether the destruction evidence found in Troy VA represents the aftermath of warfare, earthquake, fire, or some combination of Bronze Age catastrophes that eliminated this iteration of the city. Burned layers and scattered human remains suggest violent destruction, but determining whether that violence was Mycenaean Greeks seeking to rescue Helen or just routine Bronze Age conflict requires interpretive skills that archaeology can't definitively provide, no matter how carefully researchers examine pottery fragments and arrowhead distributions. The site reveals Troy's evolution from Bronze Age trading post to Roman tourist destination, where citizens of the empire visited to see the legendary battleground that had inspired their favorite epic literature. Roman Troy was essentially ancient heritage tourism, complete with reconstructed monuments, guided tours, and probably gift shops selling miniature wooden horses that bore only passing resemblance to the original siege engine that may or may not have actually existed outside poetic imagination. You trace the remains of walls that were rebuilt, reinforced, and modified across centuries as successive civilizations adapted the site to their needs, strategic requirements, and architectural preferences. Each layer tells stories of continuity and change. Bronze Age foundations supporting classical Greek structures, supporting Roman renovations, supporting Byzantine modifications that created archaeological complexity requiring decades of careful excavation to untangle chronologically. The famous ramp that Schliemann identified as evidence of siege warfare may actually be a natural geological formation modified by human activity. Though distinguishing between ancient military engineering and accumulated debris requires expertise that combines archaeology, geology, and probably advanced training in distinguishing intentional construction from accidental accumulation. The romance of discovering Achilles' battlefield sometimes conflicts with the mundane reality of Bronze Age urban development and routine infrastructure maintenance. Water management systems throughout the site demonstrate sophisticated engineering that enabled Troy to withstand extended sieges, whether legendary or historical. Underground cisterns, carefully channeled springs, and defensive positioning that controlled access to fresh water sources suggest planners who understood that successful urban defense required more than impressive walls. It demanded sustainable resource management that could outlast enemy patience and seasonal campaigning constraints. As afternoon light slants across the excavated ruins, casting shadows that emphasize architectural details worn smooth by millennia of wind and weather, you realize you're standing at the intersection of literature and archaeology, where Homer's poetry meets Bronze Age reality in ways that neither completely validates nor entirely contradicts. The site is simultaneously more and less than the Iliad promised. More complex archaeologically, less dramatically clear-cut than epic literature suggested. The view from Troy's highest point encompasses the Dardanelles Strait that connects the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, revealing why this location remains strategically important across millennia of shifting empires, trade routes, and military campaigns. Control of this narrow waterway meant economic and military advantages that would inspire conflict regardless of whether beautiful princesses were involved in the specific disagreements that ancient poets chose to commemorate in hexameter verse. Historians still debate whether the Trojan War represents historical memory of actual Bronze Age conflict, literary imagination inspired by the site's obvious strategic importance, or some combination of fact and fiction that transforms historical possibilities into mythological certainties. The truth probably involves elements of all three interpretations. Real conflicts elevated to legendary status through centuries of poetic elaboration that made good stories more important than precise historical accuracy. The Ottoman fortress that crowns the modern hill demonstrates how Troy's strategic value persisted long after Bronze Age civilizations disappeared, with successive military engineers recognizing the same geographical advantages that made this location valuable to Bronze Age city planners, classical Greek colonists, Roman administrators, and everyone else who understood the military and economic implications of controlling important waterways. As evening approaches and the winds carry echoes that might be ancient voices or might just be tourists discussing whether they're really standing where Achilles dragged Hector around the city walls, you understand why Troy continues to fascinate both archaeologists and anyone who's ever wondered where legend ends and history begins. The site embodies the eternal tension between what we hope happened and what evidence can prove, between the dramatic certainties of epic poetry and the careful uncertainties of archaeological interpretation. You're walking across sun-warmed stones in Crete, where the Mediterranean air carries scents of wild herbs and ancient mysteries that seem to shimmer in the morning heat, like secrets waiting to be discovered by someone patient enough to wander through corridors that were already ancient when Homer was composing his epics. The Palace of Knossos spreads before you like a three-dimensional puzzle designed by architects who apparently never met a straight line they couldn't turn into an elegant curve, creating a labyrinthine complex that might have inspired the legend of the Minotaur, or might just represent Bronze Age urban planning by people who really enjoyed confusing their visitors. The approach to the palace reveals Minoan civilization at its sophisticated peak, where Europe's first advanced culture flourished between 2000 and 1450 BCE with attitudes toward art, religion, and daily life that were startlingly modern, considering they predated classical Greece by over a millennium. The restored columns rise before you in that distinctive downward tapering style that makes them look like inverted trees, painted in deep red against cream-colored walls that seem to glow with an inner warmth that contemporary interior designers would probably kill to reproduce in their minimalist showrooms. Your first steps in the complex immediately reveal why Sir Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist who excavated and extensively restored this site in the early 20th century, became convinced he discovered the legendary labyrinth of Greek mythology. Corridors branch and wind in directions that seem to follow some internal logic that makes perfect sense until you try to retrace your path and discover you're completely lost in a Bronze Age maze that was probably designed by people who enjoyed watching visitors walk in circles while pretending to be helpful with directions. The walls burst with frescoes that demonstrate Minoan artistic achievement at its most vivid and psychologically puzzling. The famous Prince of the Lilies strides across painted plaster with elaborate feathered crown and confident bearing. The recent analysis suggests this might actually be a composite figure created by Evans from fragments of multiple frescoes, which means we might be admiring the world's earliest example of archaeological Photoshop rather than authentic Bronze Age royal portraiture. Little known fact, the Minoans possessed sophisticated indoor plumbing that included flush toilets, running water, and sewage systems that were more advanced than most European cities would achieve until the 19th century. The Queen's Megaron features a bathroom with what appears to be the world's first flush toilet, complete with wooden seat and sophisticated drainage that suggests Minoan attitudes toward hygiene were considerably more advanced than their contemporaries, who were still figuring out basic concepts like don't dump wastewater where you get drinking water. The throne room stops you with its austere dignity. A simple stone chair flanked by restored frescoes of griffins that seem to watch over the space with alert intelligence. This may be Europe's oldest throne room, where Minoan rulers held court in a civilization that appears to have been remarkably peaceful for a Bronze Age society. Archaeological evidence suggests the Minoans built palaces without massive defensive walls, created art that celebrates nature rather than warfare, and developed a culture where goddess worship played a central role in both religious and political life. Academic debate continues about the famous bull-leaping frescoes that show young athletes vaulting over charging bulls in displays of athleticism that would challenge contemporary gymnasts and definitely exceed modern insurance liability limits. Whether these scenes represent actual religious rituals, artistic metaphor, or some combination of ceremonial athletics and spiritual practice remains one of Minoan archaeology's most spectacular unresolved questions. The physical possibility of grabbing a charging bull by the horns and somersaulting over its back seems questionable, but the artistic evidence is so detailed that someone was definitely convinced this was either happening or worth depicting with religious reverence. You explore storage areas where massive pit hoi, ceramic jars taller than most contemporary humans, once held olive oil, wine, and grain that supported palace populations and extensive trade networks throughout the Mediterranean. The scale of these storage systems reveals economic sophistication that enabled Minoan civilization to accumulate wealth through maritime commerce while maintaining the agricultural surplus necessary to support specialized artisans, administrators, and possibly professional bull leapers whose career prospects were probably limited but undeniably exciting. The Grand Staircase demonstrates Minoan architectural engineering that created multi-story palace complexes with sophisticated ventilation, lighting, and traffic flow that would impress contemporary architects who are still struggling to design buildings that successfully integrate form and function. Light wells and air shafts carried illumination and fresh air deep into the complex, creating interior spaces that remained comfortable even during Mediterranean summers that could make stone buildings feel like ancient ovens without adequate climate control. Historians still debate what caused the sudden decline of Minoan civilization around 1450 BCE, with theories ranging from natural disasters to Mycenaean invasion to internal political collapse. The volcanic eruption at Thera, modern Santorini, may have disrupted Minoan trade networks and agricultural systems, though the timeline suggests this catastrophe preceded the final palace destructions by several decades. The mystery deepens when you realize that the Minoan script, remains undeciphered despite decades of scholarly effort, meaning their own accounts of these events remain locked in clay tablets we can see but can't read. The restoration work throughout Knossos reveals both the glory and the controversy of early 20th century archaeology. Evans' reconstructions used modern materials and interpretive guesswork that created visually stunning results while potentially obscuring original Minoan architectural details. The painted concrete columns and restored frescoes give visitors a sense of Minoan aesthetic achievement. But scholars continue to debate how much of what you're seeing represents authentic Bronze Age design and how much reflects Evan's educated imagination about what a Minoan palace should look like. As afternoon light streams through the reconstructed light wells, casting geometric patterns across floors worn smooth by thousands of years of foot traffic, you begin to understand why Minoan civilization continues to fascinate both archaeologists and anyone interested in alternative models for Bronze Age society. This wasn't just a wealthy trading culture. It was a civilization that seemed to prioritize beauty, comfort, and religious practice over military conquest and monumental ego displays. The workshop areas reveal specialized craft production that created luxury goods for both local use and international trade. Minoan artisans produced jewelry, textiles, metalwork, and ceramics that were prized throughout the ancient Mediterranean, establishing trade relationships that brought wealth and cultural influences from Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. Their artistic style influenced later Greek art, while maintaining distinctive characteristics that speak to confident cultural identity rather than mere imitation of floor models. The religious significance of the palace becomes apparent as you explore spaces that seem designed for ritual activities rather than purely administrative or residential functions. The prevalence of goddess imagery, the elaborate ceremonial areas, and the integration of religious symbolism into architectural details suggest that Minoan palaces served as both political centers and sacred spaces where earthly authority derived from divine connection through complex religious practices that we can observe but not fully understand. As evening approaches and the restored frescoes seem to come alive in the shifting light, you find yourself contemplating what Europe might have looked like if Minoan civilization had continued to flourish instead of disappearing into the Bronze Age collapse that swept across the Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Their apparent peaceful prosperity, sophisticated technology, and artistic achievement offer tantalizing glimpses of alternative paths that human civilization might have taken if historical circumstances had unfolded differently. You're standing in the middle of what was once the largest city in North America, where the morning mist rises from Illinois prairie grass that has reclaimed streets where thousands of people once conducted the daily business of running a sophisticated urban center that rivaled medieval London in population and definitely exceeded it in urban planning that actually made sense. The silence around you feels profound, almost sacred, broken only by the whisper of wind through tall grass and the occasional meadowlark whose song seems to carry echoes of voices that filled these spaces with commerce, ceremony, and probably the ancient equivalent of municipal politics that made city council meetings just as tedious in 1100 CE as they are today. Cahokia spreads around you like a vast green puzzle where earthwork mounds rise from the prairie like sleeping giants, each one representing months or years of coordinated labor that moved millions of cubic feet of soil using nothing but human hands, woven baskets, and the kind of organizational skills that would impress contemporary project managers who struggle to coordinate office potluck lunches without multiple spreadsheets and several heated email exchanges. The scale becomes overwhelming as you realize you're standing in what archaeologists call the greatest urban center ever built north of Mexico, home to perhaps 20,000 people at its peak around 1100 CE. Your feet find the remnants of ancient pathways that once connected residential neighborhoods, ceremonial areas, and agricultural zones in a carefully planned urban layout that demonstrates sophisticated understanding of hydrology, transportation, and social organization. The Mississippian culture that created Cahokia wasn't just building a big village. They were engineering a metropolitan area that required advanced knowledge of everything from flood control to waste management to the diplomatic skills necessary for governing a diverse population that included permanent residents, seasonal workers, and probably ancient tourists who came to witness the impressive ceremonial activities. Little known fact: Cahokia's Grand Plaza covers more area than 35 football fields, making it one of the largest public spaces ever constructed in pre-Columbian North America. This wasn't just empty space. It was carefully designed performance venue where thousands could gather for ceremonies, games, and public events that reinforce social bonds while demonstrating the organizational power of Cahokian leadership. The plaza's construction required removing millions of tons of earth and creating artificial terraces that controlled water flow while providing perfect acoustics for speakers addressing large crowds. You climb Monk's Mound, the massive earthwork that dominates Cahokia's skyline and represents one of the largest prehistoric construction projects in the Americas. Each step up the reconstructed stairs takes you higher above the surrounding prairie, revealing the full scope of this ancient metropolitan area that stretched for miles along the Mississippi River floodplain. From the summit, nearly 100 feet above the prairie floor, you can see mound groups extending in every direction, connected by ancient roadways that linked neighborhoods, agricultural areas, and satellite communities in a regional network that controlled trade and resources across much of the American Midwest. The view from Monk's Mound reveals Cahokia's strategic genius, positioned where the Missouri, Illinois, and Mississippi rivers converge, creating a natural transportation hub that connected trade networks stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Cahokian merchants controlled the flow of copper from Lake Superior, shell from the Gulf Coast, and exotic materials from as far away as the Rocky Mountains and the Atlantic seaboard. This wasn't just a large Native American settlement. It was the economic center of a vast commercial network that distributed goods across half the continent. Academic debate continues about what caused Cahokia's decline around 1200 CE, with theories ranging from climate change to environmental degradation to social and political upheaval that led residents to abandon their magnificent city and disperse across the surrounding region. Tree-ring data suggests a prolonged drought began around 1150 CE, while archaeological evidence indicates deforestation and soil depletion that may have made the site unsustainable for such a large population. The abandonment appears to have been gradual rather than catastrophic, suggesting planned relocation rather than sudden disaster. You explore the residential areas where Cahokian families lived in rectangular houses arranged around central courtyards, creating neighborhoods that foster community interaction while maintaining family privacy. The architectural remains reveal sophisticated understanding of climate control, with houses designed to stay cool in summer and warm in winter using passive solar heating, strategic ventilation, and building materials that provided effective insulation. These weren't primitive dwellings. They were carefully engineered homes that provided comfort and security for urban populations that included everyone from skilled craftspeople to religious leaders to administrative specialists. The specialized craft areas demonstrate economic complexity that rivals any medieval European city. Cahokian artisans produced distinctive pottery, carved stone tools, worked copper into ornamental objects, and created textiles from locally grown materials. The standardization of pottery styles across the region suggests centralized production and distribution systems that required sophisticated organizational structures to coordinate raw material acquisition, manufacturing processes, and trade relationships with distant communities. Historians still debate the exact nature of Cahokian political organization, but archaeological evidence suggests a complex hierarchical society led by powerful elites who controlled both economic and religious activities. The largest mounds likely supported temples and elite residences, while smaller mounds served as platforms for important buildings or burial sites for high-status individuals. This wasn't a simple chiefdom. It was an early urban state that managed complex social, economic, and religious functions across a vast territory. As afternoon light slants across the prairie, illuminating wildflowers that bloom where ancient neighborhoods once bustled with activity, you begin to understand why Cahokia challenges conventional narratives about pre-Columbian North America. This sophisticated urban center demonstrates that indigenous peoples created complex civilizations that were every bit as impressive as contemporary European cities, with technological innovations, artistic achievements, and organizational structures that enabled large populations to thrive in carefully managed environments. The astronomical alignments built into Cahokia's layout reveal sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles that informed both religious practice and agricultural scheduling. The famous Cahokia woodhenge, a circle of wooden posts that functioned as an astronomical observatory, enabled precise tracking of solar events that were crucial for determining planting seasons, ceremonial timing, and probably the ancient equivalent of municipal calendar planning that kept this complex society functioning smoothly across multiple generations. The agricultural systems that supported Cahokia's population demonstrate environmental engineering that transformed the Mississippi River floodplain into productive farmland capable of feeding thousands of urban residents. Raised fields, controlled flooding, and sophisticated crop management techniques enabled intensive agriculture that produced maize, beans, squash, and other crops in quantities sufficient to support both permanent populations and seasonal influxes of visitors who came for trade, ceremony, or probably ancient conventions that brought together people from across the Mississippian cultural network. Water management throughout the site shows understanding of hydrology that prevented flooding while ensuring adequate water supplies for drinking, cooking, and crafts that required controlled water access. Drainage ditches, artificial ponds, and carefully positioned settlements demonstrate that Cahokian engineers understood how to work with rather than against the natural flooding patterns that could either destroy urban areas or provide fertility and transportation advantages when properly managed. As evening approaches and the restored prairie begins to settle into that profound quiet that only exists in vast open spaces, you realize you're standing in one of North America's greatest archaeological treasures, a place that demonstrates the sophistication, creativity, and organizational capacity of indigenous civilizations that flourished for centuries before European contact transformed the continent's demographic and cultural landscape in ways that buried achievements like Cahokia beneath layers of historical amnesia and cultural misunderstanding. You're pushing through vines that seem personally committed to preventing your progress, where the Amazon air hangs so thick with humidity that breathing feels like drinking soup, and every step forward into this green cathedral takes you deeper into one of the most enduring mysteries of modern exploration. The canopy overhead blocks most sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight that makes noon feel like dusk and transforms the simple act of navigation into an exercise in faith, compass reading, and the kind of optimism that convinced Percy Fawcett to disappear into these same depths in 1925, searching for a lost civilization that may have been more real than anyone dare believe. The jungle sounds surround you in layers, the constant drip of condensation from leaves, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the understory, and somewhere in the distance, the haunting call of a jaguar that reminds you why indigenous peoples developed such respectful relationships with environments that could kill you in approximately 17 different ways before lunch. Your machete cuts through lianas that immediately spring back into place, as if the rainforest has developed its own immune system against human intrusion and takes your presence as a personal insult to its perfectly organized chaos. Following what may or may not be an ancient trail, you trace the footsteps of countless explorers who ventured into this green labyrinth, seeking everything from gold to rubber to the legendary cities that Spanish conquistadors heard about from indigenous peoples who may have been engaging in the 16th century equivalent of sending annoying tourists somewhere far away. The path beneath your boots feels worn smooth by centuries of feet, human, animal, and possibly something else entirely that left marks archaeologists are still debating in academic papers that probably don't get read outside very specialized circles. Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett emerges from the historical mist like a figure from adventure fiction, except his story was real and significantly more tragic than anything Hollywood would dare script. A British artillery officer turned explorer, Fawcett spent decades mapping remote regions of South America for the Royal Geographic Society, developing theories about ancient civilizations that were equal parts archaeological insight and romantic imagination, fueled by Victorian confidence that Europeans could find anything if they just brought enough determination and proper equipment. Little known fact, Fawcett's quest wasn't based purely on speculation. He carried with him a small stone idol given to him by British psychic researcher H. Rider Haggard, who claimed it originated from a lost Atlantean city in Brazil. Whether you believe in psychic archaeology or not, Fawcett was convinced this artifact pointed toward a sophisticated urban center he called Z, hidden somewhere in the Mato Grosso region where few Europeans had ventured and even fewer had returned to file proper expedition reports. The deeper you penetrate into this living maze, the more you understand both the allure and the impossibility of Fawcett's quest. The Amazon doesn't just hide things. It actively consumes them, wrapping abandoned settlements in vines, filling foundations with root systems, and transforming human artifacts into organic matter with the efficiency of a biological recycling program that makes contemporary environmental initiatives look half-hearted. Any city that survived here would need to work with the jungle rather than against it, becoming part of the ecosystem rather than conquering it. Academic debate continues about whether Fawcett's city of Z was inspired by legitimate archaeological evidence or romantic mythologizing about El Dorado and other legendary American kingdoms. Recent discoveries using LiDAR technology have revealed massive earthwork complexes throughout the Amazon that suggest sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations did indeed create urban centers in regions previously thought too hostile for large-scale human settlement. Fawcett may have been wrong about the details, but remarkably prescient about the general possibility of lost Amazonian cities. You pause at what appears to be an artificial clearing, where geometric patterns in the forest floor suggest human engineering that predates European contact by centuries. These geoglyphs, massive earthworks visible only from above or through careful ground survey, demonstrate that indigenous peoples transformed vast areas of Amazonian landscape through controlled burning, selective planting, and earth-moving projects that created what scientists now call anthropogenic forests designed to support large populations without destroying the underlying ecosystem. The silence here feels different from normal jungle quiet, less random, more purposeful, as if the forest is holding its breath around spaces that humans once inhabited with greater permanence than the scattered villages that European explorers expected to find. Tree species distribution reveals signs of deliberate cultivation, with concentrations of useful plants that suggest managed groves where ancient peoples grew food, medicine, and raw materials in quantities sufficient to support urban populations that contemporary estimates place in the hundreds of thousands. As afternoon light filters through the canopy in scattered beams that illuminate floating pollen like golden snow, you begin to understand why Fawcett became obsessed with proving that the Amazon concealed civilizations as sophisticated as anything in the Old World. His expeditions occurred during an era when European archaeology was revolutionizing understanding of human prehistory, revealing advanced societies in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley. Fawcett believed South America deserved similar recognition for indigenous achievements that Spanish conquistadors had either destroyed or never bothered to document properly. Historians still debate what happened to Fawcett's final expedition in 1925, where he disappeared with his eldest son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel somewhere in the Mato Grosso region. Local indigenous groups reported various encounters with European explorers, but none definitively identified Fawcett's party, and subsequent search expeditions found only scattered artifacts that could have belonged to any number of explorers who had ventured into these same trackless regions with inadequate preparation and excessive confidence. The preservation challenges in tropical environments like this are staggering. Organic materials decompose rapidly in the heat and humidity. Metal corrodes in months rather than years, and even stone structures disappear beneath aggressive vegetation with shocking speed. Any evidence of Fawcett's passage would have been absorbed by the jungle within a few seasons, making archaeological recovery virtually impossible unless his party reached some kind of permanent shelter that protected their remains from the biological forces that treat human artifacts like particularly interesting compost material. You discover what looks like a stone foundation partially hidden beneath centuries of leaf litter and root growth. It's precisely fitted blocks, suggesting construction techniques that required sophisticated engineering knowledge and organized labor forces. The craftsmanship speaks to cultural achievements that challenge traditional narratives about pre-Columbian America, where indigenous societies were supposedly too primitive to create urban centers that could rival European cities in size, complexity, or technological innovation. Recent archaeological discoveries have vindicated many of Fawcett's theories about sophisticated Amazonian civilizations, though not necessarily in the locations he explored. The Acre region has revealed geometric earthworks covering thousands of square miles, while advances in remote sensing continue uncovering evidence of managed landscapes that supported populations far larger than previously thought possible in tropical forest environments. Fawcett was wrong about the specifics, but remarkably right about the general principle that the Amazon concealed major archaeological treasures. As evening approaches and the jungle settles into its nocturnal transformation, where day-shift creatures yield territory to night-shift predators in carefully orchestrated biological transitions that have continued for millions of years, you realize you're experiencing exactly what drew Fawcett deeper and deeper into this green infinity. The Amazon doesn't just hide secrets, it promises them, whispering through rustling leaves about wonders that remain just beyond the next ridge, the next river, the next clearing where human achievement might emerge from botanical concealment. The sounds of night awakening around you, the haunting calls of nocturnal birds, the splash of something large moving through nearby water, the rustle of creatures that prefer darkness for their daily activities, remind you that this environment has swallowed countless explorers who came seeking glory, knowledge, or simple adventure. Yet something about the profound mystery Fawcett died pursuing continues to draw researchers, adventurers, and dreamers into depths where discovery and disappearance remain separated by nothing more substantial than preparation, luck, and the jungle's unpredictable moods. You're standing on the granite hills of southern Africa, where the morning air carries the scent of wild sage, an ancient achievement that European colonizers would spend decades trying to explain away, because acknowledging the truth would have complicated their carefully constructed narratives about African capabilities. The stone walls rise around you like organic growth from the earth itself, their curves following the natural contours of granite outcroppings with such fluid grace that distinguishing between human engineering and geological formation requires careful observation and probably a few arguments with people who have very strong opinions about pre-colonial African architecture. Great Zimbabwe spreads across these rolling hills like a meditation on permanence, where Shona builders created stone enclosures that have withstood 5 centuries of weather, political upheaval, and determined European efforts to attribute their construction to anyone except the indigenous peoples who obviously built them. The walls contain no mortar, relying instead on precisely fitted granite blocks that demonstrate mastery of dry stone construction techniques, sophisticated enough to make contemporary stonemasons moderately envious of ancient African engineering skills that accomplished so much with such elegant simplicity. Your fingers trace the smooth surfaces of granite blocks that were shaped using nothing more than heating and cooling techniques that split stone along natural fracture lines, then carefully dressed to create the uniform building materials that enabled these sweeping walls to rise without benefit of cement, steel reinforcement, or construction permits that would have required environmental impact studies and probably several public hearings about the aesthetic implications of building large stone cities in sensitive ecological areas. The morning light illuminates walls that curve and flow like frozen music, their gentle undulations creating enclosures that feel organic rather than imposing, protective rather than fortress-like. This wasn't military architecture designed to repel invaders. These were ceremonial and residential spaces that housed the ruling elite of a sophisticated trading civilization that controlled gold and ivory commerce between the African interior and Indian Ocean ports for over 3 centuries. Little known fact, Great Zimbabwe was abandoned gradually around 1450 CE, not because of conquest or catastrophe, but likely due to resource depletion and changing trade patterns that made other locations more economically viable. The residents didn't flee in panic. They conducted an organized relocation that left the stone structures intact while removing portable valuables and probably most of the really good furniture that would have made archaeological interpretation significantly easier for confused Europeans who arrived centuries later. You climb toward the Great Enclosure, the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara, where walls rise over 30 feet and extend for nearly 820 feet in a graceful ellipse that encloses sacred spaces where Shona rulers conducted ceremonies that connected earthly authority to spiritual power through religious practices that emphasized harmony between human communities and natural forces. The famous conical tower at the enclosure's heart remains one of Africa's greatest architectural mysteries. Its solid granite construction serving purposes that scholars continue to debate with the kind of passionate disagreement that makes academic conferences surprisingly entertaining. The acoustics within these stone enclosures create remarkable sound environments where whispered conversations carry clearly across courtyards while outside noise fades to gentle background murmur. Ancient Shona architects understood that sacred spaces required acoustic properties that supported both intimate ritual activities and larger ceremonial gatherings, designing stone chambers that transformed human voices into something that felt touched by divine presence through careful attention to architectural acoustics that most contemporary building designers completely ignore. Academic debate continues about the exact nature of Great Zimbabwe's political organization, but archaeological evidence suggests a complex state society that controlled trade networks extending from the Zambezi River to the Indian Ocean coast. The concentration of imported goods, Chinese porcelain, Persian glassware, Arabian beads, demonstrates economic relationships that connected African gold miners to Asian markets through commercial networks that European traders would later desperately try to control and inevitably mismanage. You explore residential areas where archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated urban planning that provided housing for specialists, traders, and administrators who supported the complex economic and political activities that made Great Zimbabwe the largest settlement in medieval southern Africa. Stone platforms supported houses built from clay and timber, creating neighborhoods where thousands of people lived in comfort that included indoor plumbing, organized waste management, and probably zoning regulations that prevented people from keeping too many cattle in residential areas. The preservation of organic materials in Great Zimbabwe's favorable climate has provided archaeologists with detailed information about daily life in medieval Africa that challenges every stereotype about pre-colonial African societies. Textile fragments reveal sophisticated weaving techniques. Metal artifacts demonstrate advanced ironworking and goldsmithing, while agricultural remains show farming practices that sustained large urban populations without depleting soil resources through techniques that contemporary sustainable agriculture specialists are still trying to perfect. As afternoon heat builds across the granite landscape, you find shade within stone enclosures that create natural cooling systems through careful orientation and strategic airflow that makes these ancient buildings more comfortable than many contemporary structures lacking adequate climate control. Shona builders understood passive solar design principles that enabled stone architecture to remain livable in challenging environments through engineering wisdom that required no fossil fuels, electric fans, or expensive HVAC systems that constantly break down at the worst possible moments. The ironworking areas reveal technological sophistication that produced both agricultural tools and luxury items for local use and international trade. Great Zimbabwe's metallurgists created steel implements that were superior to European equivalents, developing smelting techniques that produced high-quality metal using locally available materials and indigenous knowledge that European colonizers would later dismiss as primitive despite being unable to reproduce the same results with their supposedly superior technology. Historians still debate why European explorers and early archaeologists were so determined to attribute Great Zimbabwe's construction to non-African peoples, suggesting everyone from ancient Phoenicians to medieval Arabs rather than acknowledging obvious evidence of indigenous achievement. The racist assumptions underlying these theories reflect colonial ideologies that couldn't accommodate evidence of sophisticated African civilizations, leading to decades of archaeological interpretation that said more about European prejudices than African capabilities. The trading connections revealed through imported artifacts demonstrate that Great Zimbabwe was far from isolated, participating in commercial networks that brought Asian ceramics, Middle Eastern beads, and Indian Ocean shells to the African interior in exchange for gold, ivory, and other local products that were highly valued in distant markets. These weren't simple barter transactions. They were complex commercial relationships that required diplomatic skills, economic knowledge, and cultural sophistication that enabled African traders to negotiate successfully with merchants from multiple continents. Water management systems throughout the site show sophisticated understanding of hydrology that captured and channeled rainfall to support urban populations and agricultural activities during both wet and dry seasons. Stone-lined channels, artificial ponds, and carefully positioned settlements demonstrate that Great Zimbabwe's engineers understood how to work with rather than against natural water patterns, creating sustainable urban infrastructure that functioned reliably for centuries without requiring constant maintenance or expensive repairs. As evening shadows begin to lengthen across the granite landscape, casting the stone walls in warm golden light that makes their curves seem almost alive, you understand why Great Zimbabwe continues to symbolize African achievement for people across the continent and beyond. These walls represent more than architectural skill. They embody intellectual traditions, cultural achievements, and economic sophistication that demonstrate the diversity and complexity of human civilization in ways that challenge simplified narratives about historical development. The setting sun transforms the stone enclosures into silhouettes that seem to pulse with accumulated memory, where centuries of human activity created spaces that feel simultaneously ancient and timeless. Standing among these walls as darkness gathers, you realize you're experiencing the enduring power of human creativity to transform landscape into meaning, stone into story, and architectural achievement into cultural identity that survives long after its creators have joined the vast community of ancestors whose wisdom speaks through permanent monuments to their vision, skill, and determination. You're standing on a windswept plateau in southeastern Turkey, where the morning air carries the scent of wild herbs and something indefinable that feels like the breath of time itself, waiting patiently to reveal secrets that predate everything you thought you knew about human civilization. The limestone pillars rise around you like ancient sentinels frozen in eternal ceremony, their carved surfaces catching sunlight that illuminates animal reliefs so vivid they seem ready to leap from stone into life. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it's about to completely rearrange your understanding of what our hunter-gatherer ancestors were capable of achieving when they apparently got bored with just hunting and gathering and decided to invent monumental architecture about 6,000 years before anyone else thought to try. The scale becomes overwhelming as you realize these stone circles were carved, transported, and erected by people who hadn't yet figured out agriculture, pottery, or even basic metallurgy, but somehow managed to organize labor forces capable of moving multi-ton limestone blocks with precision that would challenge contemporary construction crews equipped with cranes, GPS systems, and probably several energy drinks to maintain focus during the more challenging engineering moments. The T-shaped pillars tower above you, some reaching 18 feet in height, arranged in circles that create sacred spaces where prehistoric peoples gathered for purposes that archaeologists are still debating with the kind of passionate disagreement that makes academic conferences surprisingly entertaining. Your fingers trace carved reliefs that seem to pulse with life under the warming morning sun. Snakes undulate across stone surfaces. Wild boars charge through limestone landscapes, and birds of prey spread wings that span millennia between their creation in your wonder at the artistic sophistication displayed by people who were supposedly too busy surviving to develop complex religious practices, monumental architecture, or the organizational skills necessary to complete construction projects. That would take decades to finish. Little known fact, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE, covered with tons of earth in what appears to be an intentional act of preservation or concealment that protected these stone circles for 10 millennia until German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavations in 1995. The burial wasn't natural accumulation. It was purposeful entombment that suggests the site's creators understood they were building something important enough to preserve for future discovery, though they probably didn't anticipate that discovery would completely revolutionize archaeological understanding of prehistoric human capabilities. The craftsmanship visible in every carved detail speaks to artistic traditions that were already sophisticated when these monuments were created, suggesting that the skills, tools, and cultural knowledge necessary for such achievement have been developing for generations before reaching the expression you're witnessing today. This wasn't beginner's luck in monumental construction. It was the culmination of intellectual and technical traditions that challenged linear narratives about human cultural evolution, from simple to complex, primitive to advanced. Academic debate continues about whether Göbekli Tepe represents the world's first temple or something else entirely. Perhaps an astronomical observatory, a social gathering place, or a combination of sacred, practical, and ceremonial functions that don't fit neatly into contemporary categories for understanding how prehistoric peoples organized their spiritual, social, and intellectual lives. Recent research suggests the site may have served multiple purposes simultaneously, creating sacred spaces that also functioned as centers for cultural exchange, information sharing, and possibly prehistoric continuing education programs for hunter-gatherer professionals. You move between the stone circles, each one unique in its arrangement and decorative program, revealing planned diversity that speaks to sophisticated understanding of architectural variety, ceremonial requirements, and probably ancient aesthetic preferences that demanded visual interest rather than boring repetition of identical designs. The builders weren't just following blueprints. They were creating individual artistic statements within an overall architectural program that balanced unity with creativity in ways that would impress contemporary urban planners who struggle to achieve such harmonious diversity in modern developments. The animal reliefs covering the pillars create a bestiary of Pleistocene fauna that provides detailed information about the ecosystem that surrounded Göbekli Tepe during its active period. Lions, leopards, wild cattle, and other now extinct or relocated species were carved with anatomical accuracy that demonstrates close observation of animal behavior, hunting knowledge, and artistic skills that capture not just physical appearance, but the essence of animal movement, power, and spiritual significance in ways that suggest these creatures held important places in prehistoric belief systems. As afternoon heat builds across the limestone plateau, you find yourself contemplating implications that extend far beyond archaeology into fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the origins of civilization itself. If hunter-gatherers could create Göbekli Tepe, then our assumptions about linear cultural development from simple to complex societies require serious revision. These people weren't waiting for agriculture to enable complex cultural achievement. They were already creating monumental architecture that required sophisticated social organization, specialized knowledge, and coordinated labor that challenges every stereotype about prehistoric human capabilities. The preservation challenges at Göbekli Tepe are immense and ongoing. Limestone weathers quickly when exposed to rain, wind, and temperature fluctuations, requiring conservation techniques that protect ancient carvings while allowing continued archaeological investigation of a site that may contain dozens of additional stone circles still buried beneath millennia of accumulated soil. Each excavation season reveals new complexities while raising questions about how to balance research with preservation of monuments that represent humanity's earliest known monumental architecture. Historians still debate what caused Göbekli Tepe's abandonment and burial, but the timing coincides with the development of agriculture in the same region, suggesting possible connections between the rise of farming communities and the end of hunter-gatherer monumentalism. Whether the site was abandoned because agricultural societies had different religious needs, or whether the labor required for farming left insufficient time for maintaining massive stone temples, remains one of prehistoric archaeology's most intriguing questions about the relationship between subsistence strategies and cultural expression. You explore areas where ongoing excavations continue revealing new stone circles, carved pillars, and architectural features that expand understanding of Göbekli Tepe's scope and complexity. Ground-penetrating radar suggests that what has been excavated represents only a small fraction of the total site, with dozens of additional structures still buried beneath protective soil that has preserved them for 10 millennia while waiting for archaeological techniques sophisticated enough to excavate and preserve them properly. The tool marks visible on carved surfaces reveal sophisticated understanding of stoneworking techniques that enabled prehistoric craftspeople to create precise geometric forms, realistic animal representations, and decorative elements that required specialized knowledge passed down through generations of master carvers. These weren't random scratches made by amateurs. They were deliberate artistic choices executed with technical skill that demonstrates prehistoric cultural traditions far more complex than archaeological theory had previously imagined possible. As evening light begins to slant across the ancient stone circles, casting long shadows that emphasize the three-dimensional quality of carved reliefs, you find yourself surrounded by questions that extend beyond archaeology into philosophy, anthropology, and fundamental assumptions about human nature. Göbekli Tepe suggests that the urge to create sacred spaces, to gather in ceremony, to invest enormous effort in projects that serve spiritual rather than purely practical purposes, may be among humanity's most ancient and essential characteristics. The silence here feels different from the quiet of other ancient sites. Less mournful, more expectant, as if these stone circles are still waiting for ceremonies that were interrupted rather than concluded. Standing among pillars that have maintained their vigil for over 11,000 years, you understand why Göbekli Tepe continues to challenge and inspire archaeologists, historians, and anyone interested in understanding the deep roots of human creativity, spirituality, and our apparently eternal need to transform stone into meaning, effort into permanence. An individual lives into something larger than personal survival. You're walking through streets that were already ancient when Babylon was just an ambitious village, where the morning air carries the whisper of secrets written in symbols that have kept their silence for over 4,000 years. The baked brick beneath your feet forms pathways so perfectly planned that contemporary urban designers would weep with professional envy if they weren't too busy dealing with modern traffic patterns that make ancient Indus Valley city planning look like the work of time-traveling civil engineers who actually understood how to organize urban spaces for human happiness rather than automobile convenience. Harappa spreads around you in geometric precision that speaks to minds capable of envisioning entire cities before laying the first foundation stone, where every street, every building, every drainage channel was positioned according to principles that created urban environments more livable than most contemporary metropolitan areas. The grid system beneath your feet predates Manhattan's famous layout by over 3 millennia, proving that good urban planning is timeless while bad urban planning apparently requires modern technology and significantly more bureaucratic committees to achieve truly spectacular failures. Your fingers trace the smooth surfaces of standardized bricks that were manufactured to uniform dimensions across multiple cities separated by hundreds of miles, suggesting quality control systems that would impress contemporary industrial engineers who struggle to maintain consistency in products made in the same factory, let alone across entire civilizations that communicated using writing systems nobody has been able to read despite over a century of very determined scholarly effort and probably several academic nervous breakdowns. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro emerges before you, like an ancient swimming pool designed by architects who understood both hydraulic engineering and the human need for ritual purification in spaces that feel sacred rather than merely functional. The precision of the waterproofing, achieved with bitumen and finely fitted bricks, demonstrates technological sophistication that enabled this structure to hold water for over 4 millennia, which is considerably longer than most contemporary municipal swimming pools manage to function without requiring major renovations and probably several lawsuits about inadequate maintenance. Little known fact, the Indus Valley Civilization developed the world's first known urban sewage system, with sophisticated drainage networks that included covered sewers, manholes for maintenance access, and individual house connections that provided better sanitation than many European cities would achieve until the 19th century. Every house had private toilets connected to municipal drainage systems through engineering that treated waste management as a civic responsibility rather than a private problem that someone else would eventually have to solve. The undeciphered script appears everywhere, on seals, pottery, bronze implements, and carved tablets that contain approximately 400 distinct symbols arranged in sequences that clearly represent language, but refuse to yield their meaning despite decades of cryptographic analysis, computer modeling, and academic conferences, where scholars argue passionately about whether these symbols represent a syllabic script, logographic system, or something entirely different that doesn't fit into convenient linguistic categories. Academic debate continues about whether the Indus script represents a true writing system or elaborate symbolic notation for recording commercial transactions, religious practices, or administrative information. The brevity of most inscriptions, rarely exceeding 5 symbols, suggests either extreme linguistic efficiency or a writing system that supplemented rather than replaced oral communication. Without a Rosetta Stone equivalent, every proposed decipherment remains speculative, making this one of archaeology's most tantalizing unsolved puzzles. You explore residential areas where standardized housing reveals sophisticated understanding of urban planning that provided privacy, security, and comfort for populations that may have reached 40,000 people in cities like Mohenjo-Daro. The multi-story houses include private wells, drainage connections, and courtyards that created microclimates suitable for domestic activities while maintaining the kind of neighborhood density that contemporary urban planners struggle to achieve without creating anonymous housing projects that feel more like architectural storage units than human communities. The Great Granary at Harappa demonstrates agricultural surplus management that enabled urban populations to thrive without requiring every citizen to participate directly in food production. The sophisticated ventilation system prevented spoilage while protecting stored grain from moisture, pests, and probably ancient rodents who were just as interested in free food as their contemporary descendants. This wasn't just a big warehouse. It was agricultural infrastructure that enabled economic specialization, craft production, and the kind of complex society that required writing systems to keep track of increasingly complicated commercial and administrative transactions. As afternoon heat builds across the ancient cityscape, you find cooling relief in shaded courtyards where Indus Valley families once escaped the intense subcontinental climate through architectural design that created comfortable domestic spaces without requiring air conditioning, electric fans, or the kind of energy-intensive cooling systems that make contemporary urban living so dependent on reliable electrical grids and affordable utility bills. The uniformity visible throughout Indus Valley sites suggests centralized planning that coordinated construction standards, measurement systems, and probably municipal regulations across cities separated by vast distances. Whether this standardization resulted from political control, cultural agreement, or commercial convenience remains debated, but the consistency of brick sizes, street widths, and drainage systems indicates organizational capacity that enabled this civilization to maintain coherent urban standards across territories larger than most contemporary nations. Historians still debate what caused the Indus Valley civilization's decline around 1900 BCE, with theories ranging from climate change to river course changes to invasion by Indo-Aryan peoples. Recent evidence suggests gradual abandonment rather than sudden catastrophe, with populations migrating eastward as environmental conditions became less favorable for intensive agriculture. The mystery deepens because we can't read their own accounts of these events, making the Indus Valley people frustratingly silent witnesses to their own historical transformation. The sophisticated weights and measures found throughout Indus sites reveal commercial systems that enabled trade relationships extending from Afghanistan to Gujarat, creating economic networks that distributed raw materials and finished goods across subcontinental distances. The precision of these standardized measurements suggests mathematical knowledge and quality control that facilitated commerce between communities that may have spoken different languages but shared commercial protocols sophisticated enough to enable complex economic relationships. The famous priest-king sculpture from Mohenjo-daro depicts an individual whose elaborate clothing and confident bearing suggest political or religious authority. Though without readable texts, we can't determine whether this represents an actual ruler, deity, or idealized cultural figure. The artistic sophistication visible in this small limestone sculpture demonstrates aesthetic traditions that valued realistic portraiture while maintaining stylistic conventions that speak to mature artistic traditions rather than primitive experimental efforts. As evening approaches and the ancient streets settle into shadows that have been falling across these same pathways for 4 millennia, you find yourself contemplating silence that feels pregnant with meaning rather than empty of information. The Indus Valley script remains mute, but the cities themselves speak eloquently about human organizational capacity, technological innovation, and urban planning that created livable communities in challenging environments through engineering wisdom that contemporary planners are still trying to understand and replicate. The preservation of organic materials in favorable climatic conditions has provided archaeologists with detailed information about Indus Valley crafts, agriculture, and daily life that reveals sophisticated cultural achievements extending far beyond urban planning into textile production, metallurgy, and artistic traditions that influenced subcontinental development for centuries after the civilization's political decline. These weren't just competent city builders. They were cultural innovators whose achievements in multiple fields demonstrate intellectual traditions that deserve recognition alongside better documented ancient civilizations. Standing among ruins where every brick carries potential meaning and every carved symbol holds locked secrets, you understand why the Indus Valley civilization continues to fascinate scholars and inspire continued research efforts. These silent cities represent human achievement that speaks across millennia despite our inability to read their words, proving that some forms of communication transcend language while others guard their secrets with the patience of perfectly laid bricks that have outlasted empires. You're descending through layers of Mediterranean blue that grow deeper and more mysterious with each gentle kick of your fins, where the morning sunlight filters down in shifting columns that dance across an underwater cityscape that shouldn't exist but absolutely does. The water around you tastes of salt and time, carrying with it the weight of centuries when this wasn't the bottom of the sea but the bustling harbor of Thonis-Heracleion, Egypt's most important port city that somehow managed to slip beneath the waves while everyone was presumably too busy with other things to notice an entire metropolis relocating to the seafloor. The first glimpse of submerged architecture stops your underwater breathing completely, which is probably not recommended diving technique, but understandable when you're confronted with temple columns rising from sandy depths like ancient skyscrapers that decided to embrace aquatic living. Massive stone blocks emerge from the sediment in perfect geometric formation, their surfaces now decorated with coral growth and marine vegetation that creates the kind of underwater garden that no landscape architect could intentionally design, though the fish seem to appreciate the upgraded neighborhood amenities. You swim between granite columns that once supported the great temple of Ammonius-Cherub, where Egyptian priests conducted ceremonies for the god, who protected sailors venturing into dangerous Mediterranean waters that apparently weren't dangerous enough to protect the temple itself from eventually becoming an underwater archaeological site. The irony isn't lost on you that a temple dedicated to maritime protection ended up beneath the very waters it was supposed to help people navigate safely, which seems like either cosmic humor or very specific divine punishment for insufficient insurance coverage. Marine archaeologist Frank Gaudio and his team discovered this submerged wonder in 2000, using sophisticated sonar equipment and underwater excavation techniques that revealed a city larger and more important than anyone had imagined based on ancient texts that mentioned Thonis-Heracleion but provided only tantalizing hints about its location, size, or the spectacular manner of its disappearance beneath waves that transformed streets into diving sites and buildings into artificial reefs. Little known fact, Thonis and Heracleion were actually the same city, known by different names to Egyptian and Greek inhabitants respectively, which created centuries of scholarly confusion about whether these were separate ports or the same location described by different cultural perspectives. Recent underwater excavations have definitively proven they were identical, settling an academic debate that probably generated more heated conference discussions than the city's residents ever imagined their home would inspire. The preservation beneath Mediterranean waters is remarkably selective. Stone structures remain intact, while organic materials have long since dissolved, creating an underwater museum where visitors can swim through temple foundations and harbor installations while fish schools dart between columns like living exhibits in an aquarium that spans several city blocks. The salt water has acted as both destroyer and preserver, corroding metal artifacts while protecting stone carvings that remain sharp enough to read after more than a millennium underwater. You glide past colossal statues that lie scattered across the seafloor like fallen giants, their granite faces gazing eternally upward towards surface light they haven't seen since earthquakes and soil liquefaction sent them tumbling into depths where they now provide shelter for marine life that probably doesn't appreciate the historical significance of using pharaonic sculptures as fish condominiums. The largest statue depicts a pharaoh over 16 feet tall, weighing several tons, carved with precision that survived its underwater tumble better than most contemporary public art survives basic weather exposure. Academic debate continues about exactly what caused Thonis-Heracleion's submersion, with geological evidence suggesting a combination of earthquakes, soil liquefaction, and gradual sea level rise that transformed solid ground into underwater real estate over several centuries. The process wasn't sudden catastrophe, but gradual transformation that gave residents time to relocate, though apparently not enough time to take their really good statues and temple decorations with them to their new neighborhoods. The harbor installations reveal sophisticated port management that controlled Egypt's international trade for over 6 centuries, where ships from across the Mediterranean brought luxury goods, raw materials, and probably ancient tourists seeking exotic experiences in the land of pharaohs and pyramids. Massive anchor stones still rest where ancient vessels once moored, their positions marking shipping channels that guided commercial traffic through waters that are now popular diving destinations for contemporary tourists seeking different kinds of exotic experiences. As afternoon light filters through the water in constantly shifting patterns that transform the underwater cityscape into something that seems almost alive, you discover residential areas where ordinary Egyptians lived their daily lives in a city that was simultaneously cosmopolitan port and traditional Egyptian settlement. House foundations reveal urban planning that provided comfort and privacy while accommodating the commercial activities that made Thonis-Heracleion wealthy enough to afford the massive temple complexes and monumental sculptures that now create underwater archaeological wonders. The religious artifacts scattered across the seafloor speak to spiritual practices that blended Egyptian tradition with influences from across the Mediterranean world, creating cultural synthesis that reflected the international character of major port cities where different religious traditions encountered each other through trade relationships, diplomatic missions, and probably ancient cultural exchange programs that were less formally organized but more effective than many contemporary international relations initiatives. Historians still debate whether Thonis-Heracleion's submersion represents unique geological circumstances or similar fate awaiting other coastal cities built on unstable delta soils. Alexandria's ancient harbor has also revealed submerged structures, suggesting that geological processes affecting the Nile Delta have been transforming Egyptian coastlines for millennia, creating underwater archaeological sites that provide unique preservation conditions for studying ancient urban life. The continuing excavations reveal new discoveries each season, from ship's cargoes to religious statues to everyday objects that provide intimate glimpses into daily life in ancient Egypt's most important international port. Each artifact emerges from protective sediment like mail from the ancient world, delivering messages about commerce, religion, and cultural interaction that academic papers struggle to capture as vividly as direct underwater encounter with material remains of vanished civilization. The fish swimming between ancient columns seem to understand something about the continuity of life that transcends human architectural ambitions. They've made homes and spaces that once echoed with human voices, creating new communities in urban spaces abandoned by their original inhabitants, but still providing shelter, still serving purposes, still connecting past to present through the simple persistence of stone structures that outlast the civilizations that created them. And now, as the underwater light begins to soften and fade, as the currents slow to gentle rhythms that rock the ancient stones like a lullaby sung by the sea itself, you find yourself floating peacefully among these monuments to human ambition and natural transformation. Your breathing slows to match the gentle pulse of the Mediterranean waters. In and out, like the eternal rhythm that has been washing over these stones for over 1,000 years. Each breath connects you to the countless others who have moved through these spaces, ancient merchants, Egyptian priests, and now you, all part of the same continuous story. The fish drift past in lazy schools, their movements hypnotic and soothing, while the stone faces of pharaohs gaze upward with eternal patience. They've learned the secret of rest, of letting go, of allowing the currents to carry away the day's concerns. The temples that once rang with ceremony now know only the peaceful whisper of water, the gentle caress of underwater currents, the soft murmur of marine life that has made these ancient halls into nurseries for new generations. As you float here in this underwater cathedral, you can feel the weight of the day dissolving, carried away by currents that have been flowing since before human memory. The stone columns stand as patient guardians, watching over your rest as they've watched over the dreams of the deep for centuries. Your eyelids grow heavy as the ancient stones, settling into the soft sediment of sleep. The last rays of surface sunlight filter down like golden rain, blessing the sleeping city, blessing your peaceful descent into dreams where lost civilizations wait to share their wisdom, where stone speaks in whispers, and where the gentle rhythm of ancient waves carries you safely, softly, into the deepest, most restful sleep.